Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. It was supposed to be a quick afternoon hike. I'd gotten to the trailhead later than I planned, around 3:30, but figured I'd walk a few miles in, maybe catch the sunset on the ridge, and head back before it got too dark. I wasn't planning on going deep, just far enough to get away from traffic noise and cell towers. I'd done this loop once before, but never from that trailhead. It cuts through a pretty dense part of the forest, mostly pine, with a lot of underbrush and spots where the sun gets through. It was quiet out there. Not peaceful quiet, more like blank quiet. No wind. No birds. I remember thinking that was odd. About 45 minutes in, I passed a little offshoot trail I didn't recognize. It wasn't marked, and the path was narrow, looked like it had been used recently though. Grass was pressed down. I stood there for a minute trying to decide if I wanted to follow it or not. I don't know why I did. Curiosity, maybe. It curved downhill pretty sharply and twisted around a cluster of huge boulders, and after maybe 10 minutes, I smelled smoke. Not strong, just faint wood smoke, the kind you catch a whiff of when someone's got a fire going nearby. I figured it was a couple campers. The weird thing was, I didn't hear anything. No talking, no dogs, no movement. Just the smell. And when I rounded the bend, I saw it, a little clearing tucked in tight between trees, barely enough space for 2 tents. There was a fire pit in the middle with warm, glowing embers, no flame, just soft orange coals. Smoke rose straight up, which told me there was still heat. But nobody was there. 2 tents, both unzipped and open. A small blue cooler, a red thermos lying on its side, 2 camp chairs. One of the chairs had a hoodie draped over the back, like someone had just taken it off. And on the log near the fire pit, I saw a phone. Not dropped, placed. Screen up, no case. Next to it, a wallet. I looked around more and saw a second phone leaning against a backpack and a second wallet on top of the cooler. 2 pairs of shoes by one of the tents. No one. Not in the tents. Not behind the trees. Not on the trail. I called out a soft "hey," just once. No answer. I don't know why I didn't leave right then. It was like my brain needed a few minutes to catch up with how wrong it all felt. I kept looking around the campsite like I was going to find a note or see someone walk out of the trees laughing about a prank. But nothing happened. The fire still had heat. That meant they'd been here, what, maybe 20 minutes ago? Less. I stepped closer to the tents, just trying to figure out what I was seeing. Inside one, I could see an open sleeping bag and some clothes balled up near the feet. In the other, a paperback book face down on a pillow. I checked the phones. One of them had a cracked screen and a dead battery. The other one lit up when I tapped it. Lock screen showed a photo of 2 girls in their 20s, smiling. 5:12 p.m. The last message on the lock screen said, "Where are you guys?" I froze a little when I saw that. I hadn't thought about other people waiting on them. Friends expecting them to answer. That's when the silence really started pressing in. I listened hard. Nothing. Not even wind through the trees. I glanced up, and for a second I felt something behind me. Not a sound, not a movement, just that weird crawling feeling you get when someone's staring at you. I turned. Nothing. I told myself maybe they went to find cell signal. Maybe they got turned around. Maybe they'd be back in 5 minutes. But people don't walk off barefoot with their wallets and phones left behind. They don't leave a fire burning with their sleeping bags unzipped and a hoodie still warm from body heat. Something was wrong. I backed away, slowly, trying not to make noise even though I wasn't sure why. I didn't want to turn my back on the clearing, but I also didn't want to just stand there. I walked backwards until I hit the trees, then turned and started back up the trail, fast. I didn't run, not yet. But I walked fast enough that I was breathing hard. The trail back up to the main loop felt longer than before. I kept glancing behind me. I didn't see anyone, but I was sure someone was there. It wasn't even a feeling anymore. I knew. I heard something crunch in the underbrush maybe 50 feet off trail, and I stopped. It wasn't a deer. It was too slow. Step. Pause. Step. Then silence. I waited. Held my breath. Nothing moved. I turned and kept going, faster this time. Right before I got to the boulders again, I passed a tree with bark gouged out about eye level. Not claw marks. Knife marks. Clean slices. 3 lines. Like a tally. I didn't stop to look closer. Once I hit the main loop trail, I started jogging. Still no signal, so I just focused on getting to my car. The trail felt unfamiliar, even though I'd just come in that way. Trees looked different in the low light. The shadows were long, and the silence was worse now. That kind of silence messes with your head. You start hearing things. Or you think you do. About a quarter mile from the trailhead, I heard footsteps behind me. That steady, even pace that someone makes when they're trying to keep quiet but not too quiet. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I turned around, heart pounding, and stared down the path. No one. I waited. Listened. Not even birds. I walked backward for a few steps, eyes on the trail, then turned and jogged again. I only looked back one more time when I saw my car. It was still the only one in the lot. But right before I got to it, I saw something off to the side, near the trail map. A man. He was standing behind the signpost. Just standing there. Not hiding, not moving. Wearing dark clothes. Hoodie up. I didn't say anything. Just unlocked the car, got in, locked the doors, and started it. He didn't move. I pulled out fast and didn't look back. Drove until I had signal again and called the ranger station. I told them everything I saw or didn't see. They said they'd send someone out and asked if I could meet them back at the trailhead. I said no. A few days later, I checked local news. No missing persons, no reports, no articles. But I know what I saw, and I'm not going back out there again. It was my 3rd night out. I'd driven about 5 hours north to camp solo, something I'd done a handful of times before. This spot wasn't totally off-grid, but it was quiet. No cell signal, and the nearest parking lot was 2 miles down the trail. I picked a flat clearing about 30 feet off a little stream. Not an official campsite, but it had a fire ring made from stones and a couple of logs someone had dragged over to sit on. There were no other tents along the trail when I came in, and I hadn't seen anyone all day. I spent the afternoon reading in the hammock, filtered some water, made dinner. It was one of those perfect late summer evenings, warm enough for short sleeves, but cooling off fast. I got the fire going just as the light started fading. Around dusk, I heard footsteps coming from the trail. At first I figured it was just a late hiker. The steps were steady, but not hurried. Whoever it was wasn't lost. I sat on the log near the fire and watched. And then this guy stepped into the clearing. He didn't say anything. Just looked at me, then at the fire, then walked over and sat on the other log. No wave, no smile, no hey, mind if I rest a minute? Nothing. He looked like he was maybe late 30s or early 40s, scruffy, short hair, a little sunburned. Khaki pants, gray t-shirt, small pack, the kind people use for day hikes. I sat there waiting for him to speak, but he didn't. He just stared at the fire. After a few seconds I said, "Hey." He didn't respond. He wasn't looking at me, just staring into the flames with this kind of flat expression. No emotion at all. I tried again. Long hike. Still nothing. He blinked once, really slow, but that was it. At that point I was getting uncomfortable. Not scared, exactly, just thrown off. It was weird. People don't act like that. He didn't look drunk or high. He wasn't swaying or slurring or glassy-eyed. He just looked blank. I stood up and grabbed my water bottle off the ground, mostly to give myself something to do. I walked over to my tent like I needed to get something. Unzipped it, stepped halfway inside, and just stood there for a second. He didn't move. Didn't look at me. Didn't even shift. I came back out and stood by the fire, a little farther from him this time. I thought maybe he was just weird. Or maybe he had some kind of social anxiety thing. I don't know. But I didn't want him staying there. I said, "You camping around here?" No response. I watched him for a while. He wasn't blinking much. Just sitting, arms on his knees, watching the fire like he'd been there all day. I thought about telling him to leave. But there was something off about him, and I didn't want to provoke anything. Eventually, I just said, "Well, I'm gonna turn in soon." Nothing. I walked back over to my tent and zipped it up behind me. I sat inside for a while, just listening. I didn't hear him move. After maybe 10 minutes, I unzipped the door just a little and peeked out. He was still there. Same position. Same blank stare. I lay down on top of my sleeping bag and kept my boots on, just in case. The fire started to die down after a while, and the light outside faded to nothing. I watched the shadow of his body against the side of the tent. Still didn't move. Eventually, I dozed off for a little while. Not deep sleep, more like that half-aware drifting you get when you're not totally relaxed. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. No reason, just opened my eyes. And the shadow was gone. I listened. Didn't hear anything. I waited, holding my breath, trying to pick up the slightest sound. A stick cracked somewhere behind the tent. Not loud, more like something stepped on it by accident. I sat up, unzipped the door just an inch and looked out. He wasn't by the fire anymore. I scanned the clearing. Couldn't see much, moon was low, and the fire was just ash. I reached slowly into my pack and grabbed my flashlight, switched it on, and swept it across the trees. Nothing. But then I noticed something on the ground near where he'd been sitting. A little pile of stones. 6 of them, arranged in a perfect circle. That hadn't been there earlier. I stared at it for a while, then zipped the tent back up. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Just lay there in the dark, gripping my knife and listening for footsteps. Every little sound made me flinch. Branches creaking, leaves rustling, the occasional owl. But no voice. No other footsteps. Nothing that told me where he went. When it finally got light, I stepped outside. The circle of stones was still there. But now there was a seventh one, placed in the center. I packed up fast. Didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. Rolled up the tent half-assed and stuffed it in my bag. I kept checking the woods while I worked, waiting to see him standing there again. Never did. I left the fire pit and logs and everything else the way I found them and got the hell out. Didn't run. I didn't want to look scared if he was watching, but I walked fast. Every few minutes I looked behind me. About a half-mile down the trail, I saw footprints going off into the woods. Not deep, but fresh. Heading away from the path. I didn't follow them. Just kept moving until I got to my car. There were no other vehicles in the lot. Just mine. I got in, locked the doors, and drove straight home. Never reported it. Didn't know what I'd even say. Nothing happened, technically. But I've never been that scared of another person in my life. It was sometime past 2 a.m. when I woke up. I didn't check the time right away. I just remember it was still pitch dark and dead quiet outside. Not even bugs. I was camping solo at this little off-trail spot I'd found a couple years earlier, way up in the national forest. It was one of those places that doesn't show up on park maps, but if you follow a side path past a dry creek bed, you can find this small clearing surrounded by dense pine. No one ever goes out there, which was kind of the point. I just needed a break from everything: work, people, noise. The first 2 nights were normal. Weather was perfect. I didn't see or hear anyone the whole time. Didn't even see tire tracks near the fire road when I hiked in. That third night, I made a little fire, cooked some rice and beans, read a bit, and went to bed early. Maybe 9:30. I'd left a rain fly off the tent to get some airflow. It was warm, and I liked being able to see the trees overhead. The zipper on the tent door was right by my head. I woke up because I was cold. Not freezing, just that kind of chill that creeps in when you've been asleep for a while and the fire's long dead. I sat up and reached for the extra hoodie I'd stuffed near the foot of the sleeping bag. That's when I noticed the tent flap. It was unzipped about 2 feet down, just hanging open. The really weird part, was that the zipper was pulled inside the tent, lying next to me, like someone had unzipped it from the inside and left it that way. I was positive I'd zipped it all the way up before sleeping. I'm kind of obsessive about it, especially out there. I don't want bugs crawling in, or worse. I always check twice before lying down. Always. I sat there completely still for a second, listening. No wind. No night sounds. Just this stillness pressing in from every direction. I slowly reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam lit up the tent interior, nothing unusual. Just my pack, my boots, the book I've been reading. No tears in the mesh. No holes. I leaned forward and peeked out the flap. Nothing. Just trees and blackness. But I couldn't get over that zipper. It was bent slightly, like someone had yanked it a little too hard. And I know I didn't leave it open. I remember clearly pulling it shut, even checking the corners of the tent floor for bugs before lying down. I zipped it closed again, slowly, listening as I did. That's when I noticed my boots. They weren't where I left them. I'd taken them off and lined them up just outside the tent, toes pointing out. But now they were turned in, facing me, like someone had picked them up and put them back down the wrong way. I didn't hear anything while I was asleep. No footsteps, no twigs snapping. Nothing. But those boots had definitely been moved. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay calm. Told myself maybe I knocked them when I got up, or they shifted somehow. Maybe the zipper came down on its own, even though I knew that wasn't true. I sat up for a while with the flashlight on, just listening. Didn't hear anything but my own breathing. Eventually, I lay back down, but I didn't really sleep. I kept the flashlight in my hand and the zipper pulled all the way to the top, double-checked. Maybe 20 minutes later, I heard something. Not close, not like right outside the tent, but out in the woods. A soft crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. Then silence. A minute later, another one, farther off. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't walk like that. 2 steps, pause, then 2 more. It sounded like a person trying to move quietly. I sat up again, this time holding the flashlight like a weapon. I turned it off and listened. Nothing for a while. Then one more step. Closer than before. I slid out of my sleeping bag and crouched near the tent door, peeking out through the tiny gap between the fabric and the floor. Still nothing. Just darkness. I reached for my knife. I always bring a small one when I camp, just a basic folding blade. Not for self-defense, really. More for cooking or cutting cord. But at that moment, it was all I had. That next hour felt like the longest of my life. Every couple of minutes I thought I heard something, a breath, a whisper of movement, but I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my own panic messing with me. At some point I must have dozed off sitting up, because I woke with a jerk to faint morning light bleeding through the tent walls. I scrambled out of the tent immediately. My boots were gone. I spun around, thinking maybe they'd just been moved again, but no, they were nowhere. I searched the whole clearing, circled the trees, looked in the brush. Nothing. Then I saw the footprints. Bare feet. About 10 feet from the tent. Just 2 prints in soft dirt. Like someone had stepped forward, stood for a bit, then stepped back. No other tracks leading in or out. I packed up in less than 10 minutes. Didn't bother with breakfast. Just crammed everything into my bag and left. I hiked the whole 2 miles back to the trailhead in my socks. Didn't see anyone. Not on the trail. Not in the parking area. Not on the road out. When I got home, I checked my boots for a second time in case I'd stuffed them somewhere without remembering. Nothing. I still have no idea how someone got that close without waking me up. Or why they didn't take anything else. Or why they'd unzipped the tent from inside unless they'd actually been in there with me at some point. That part still messes with my head. It was a 3-day solo hike, something I'd done a few times before in that same section of forest. Not deep wilderness or anything, but far enough out that there's no cell service and it's rare to see anyone once you're off the main trails. I'd found this one little flat patch just off a ridgeline about a year back, no signs of use, no trash, not even old fire rings. It was peaceful. Thought I'd head back for a quiet weekend. I parked at the trailhead Friday morning and hiked in with my pack. The trail itself was calm, nice weather, nothing unusual. About an hour in, I took a detour up a side path I'd flagged in my GPS, a narrow, rocky way that eventually opened up near my spot. I remembered a certain big pine at the edge of the ridge that I'd passed last time, so when I saw it again, I knew I was close. That's when I saw the camera. A trail cam, one of those camel-wrapped ones hunters use. It was strapped to a tree maybe 30 yards from where I was planning to pitch my tent. Not hidden very well, just sitting at about chest height, pointed down toward the flat clearing I like to use. It had a small LED panel and a black lens. Quiet. No blinking lights or anything. Just there. I walked over to it and looked around. No other equipment, no blinds or feed stations nearby. Just that one camera. I don't know why it gave me a weird feeling right away. I mean, it could have been a hunter scoping out wildlife patterns, sure. But this wasn't an active hunting zone, and there were no signs posted. It wasn't even a heavily trafficked area. I'd never seen a single soul up there in all the times I'd hiked through. I stepped around to the front of the camera. It was pointed almost exactly where I was going to set up my tent. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I thought about turning back, but I'd taken time off work for this trip. Brought all my gear, planned food, everything. I figured, worst case, someone was using the area occasionally, and I'd just stay one night and move on if it got weird. So I left it alone and hiked the rest of the way up to the clearing. I pitched my tent in the usual spot near the edge of the slope, with a view of the trees below. I couldn't see the camera from there, but I knew it had a clear shot of me. First night was uneventful. Cooked some noodles, sat on a log, watched the sky go dark. Normal stuff. Heard a couple owls, nothing else. No footsteps, no animal noises. Slept fine. It was the second day when I started to notice more things. I went out exploring that morning, just doing a wide loop to check out some new game trails. About a mile out, I found another trail camera. This one was better hidden, strapped higher up, behind some branches. Same kind though. Camo pattern, same lens. This one was aimed at a section of the trail that didn't seem interesting at all. No water nearby, no signs of deer or bear. When I got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were scuff marks on the tree bark below it. Like someone had climbed up and adjusted it recently. The ground around it was disturbed too, not heavily, but enough that it looked like fresh prints had pressed into the dirt. No boot treads though. Just smoothed down patches, like whoever did it wiped them afterward. That was enough to creep me out. I headed back to camp and considered packing up, but it was still early in the day. I told myself it could still be nothing. I sat around for a bit, made some lunch, then started reading. I'd left my phone off most of the time to save battery, but I powered it up just to check the time. That's when I noticed a weird notification, the little icon you get when a Bluetooth device tries to connect. It didn't say what the device was, just that one was nearby. Then it disappeared. I wasn't using any Bluetooth gear. No earbuds, no speaker, nothing like that. It came back a few minutes later, then vanished again. I walked around the campsite with my phone out, scanning. Nothing. The notification only popped up near the edge of camp, closer to where I'd seen the first camera. That night, I didn't sleep as well. Every little sound put me on edge, rustling leaves, creaking branches. I kept imagining someone out there, just past the trees, watching. Waiting. I knew I was probably just psyching myself out, but I kept my knife close and didn't take off my boots when I got in the sleeping bag. Around 1 a.m., I woke up and noticed the tent had this faint glow on one side. Like moonlight, but warmer. I peeked out and saw a small, flickering light through the trees. Maybe 50 feet away. It looked like a flashlight or a phone screen being used just out of direct sight. Then it went out. I waited, barely breathing, listening hard. Nothing. Then, quietly, I heard a twig snap, Not far. Then another one. Someone was moving slow and careful. I stayed still for what felt like forever. I didn't want to turn on my own light. I didn't even want to breathe loud. Eventually the sound stopped. After an hour or so of silence, I unzipped the tent just a crack and looked out again. Everything was dark. Totally still. When the sun came up, I got out and did a quick sweep of the area. Found nothing at first. Then, about 20 yards from my tent, I found a used matchstick in the dirt. Not weathered or damp. Looked like it had been struck recently. Near it were two small indentations, like heel marks. No footprints though. I packed up immediately. I didn't even eat breakfast. Just shoved everything in my pack and started heading back down the trail. As I passed the first camera again, I stopped and looked at it. It was turned. The lens wasn't pointing at the clearing anymore, it was aimed lower. Directly at the trail, exactly where I was standing. That confirmed it for me. Someone had been out there. Someone had moved the camera during the night. Which meant they'd been close. Real close. I hiked out fast, barely stopping for water. When I got back to the trailhead, mine was still the only car there. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. I drove straight home. Out of curiosity, a few days later, I searched online for info about trail cams in that area, forums, hunter pages, anything like that. Nothing came up. No hunting leases listed, no known wildlife studies. And that Bluetooth notification? I looked into it. Some trail cams have wireless connections to phones or tablets. Some even live stream. Someone was watching. Recording. And I have no idea why. I was 2 nights into a solo camping trip in the Bitterroots. Nothing extreme, just something I try to do every few months to get out of the house. I'm not a hardcore survivalist or anything like that, but I like being out in the woods alone, at least. I used to. I picked a spot a little off the trail. Hiked in about 4 miles, then another half-mile through some brush to get to this small clearing I'd marked on a topo map a while back. It had a nice view of the ridge, decent cover from the wind, and a little stream 100 yards down the hill. No signs of other campers, no old fire rings, no trash, nothing. That's what I liked about it. I got everything set up around mid-afternoon. Threw a bear bag up first thing, tied it up between 2 trees about 20 feet up. I always bring a thick dry sack and one of those heavy-duty ropes with a pulley setup. I put all my food in there, plus anything with a scent, soap, toothpaste, stuff like that. I made a small fire and cooked some ramen. Sat for a while watching the sun dip behind the ridge. That night was totally quiet. I didn't hear a single thing after dark, no animals, no wind, nothing. Just a kind of stillness I usually find relaxing. The second morning, I got up and went to grab my food bag. It looked fine from a distance. Rope still tight, bag still swinging. But when I lowered it and opened it up, I noticed the top was a little off, like the drawstring had been loosened and retied, but not the way I'd done it. I looked inside and everything seemed there at first. Trail mix, jerky, instant coffee, all untouched. But then I noticed the empty slot in the mesh side pouch where I kept my camping knife, a small fixed blade Mornif I always bring. Gone. Nothing else was missing. Not even the cliff bars, which I figured would be the first thing to go if it was an animal. And no rips or bite marks on the bag. Just missing. I checked around the base of the trees. thinking maybe it fell out somehow when I pulled the bag up the night before. No sign of it. No drag marks, no fur, no scat. I started thinking maybe I just misplaced it, maybe I left it by the fire or dropped it near the tent. I checked everything. Nothing. That's when I started to feel a little off. It wasn't just the missing knife, it was the fact that whoever took it didn't touch anything else. They didn't dump the bag, didn't steal food, didn't mess with my gear. Just the knife. And the knot being retied, it was subtle, but I knew I hadn't done it that way. I told myself maybe I dropped it somewhere the day before and didn't notice. That maybe I was just overthinking it. But I kept checking my surroundings the rest of the day, listening more carefully. The forest was still quiet, maybe too quiet. I've been out there enough times to know you usually hear squirrels or birds, maybe a woodpecker somewhere. But it was just dead silent. Around midday I decided to do a little loop hike just to keep myself distracted. I followed the stream for a bit, took some photos. About a mile out, I found a set of boot prints near the bank. They weren't mine. Mine have a broken tread on the heel from where the rubber peeled back a bit. These didn't. They were newer. Deeper, too, like whoever it was carrying weight. They followed the stream north, parallel to where I'd come from the day before. I followed them for a few hundred yards before they veered off into the brush. I turned around and went straight back to camp. I didn't like the idea of someone else being out there without me knowing. It's public land, sure, but when you're miles off the main trail and haven't seen a soul, it feels personal. Whoever it was didn't make a fire, no smoke, no smell. I hadn't heard any movement at night either. They were close, and I hadn't even noticed. That evening, I didn't cook anything. Just ate a cold protein bar and sat there by the dead fire pit, listening. At one point I thought I heard something, a single stick breaking somewhere uphill. I waited. Nothing followed. When I finally got in my tent, I kept the rain fly open and the zipper halfway down, just so I could see out if I needed to. I didn't sleep much. Around 3 a.m., I heard something soft, like a shuffle. Not close, but not far either. Maybe 30 feet off. Then I heard it again. Like someone trying to step carefully, but hitting some leaves anyway. It wasn't consistent. 1 or 2 steps, then silence. I stayed completely still, listening so hard my ears were ringing. It stopped after a while. Or maybe they just stopped moving. At first light I got out and scanned the tree line. No one. No gear, no footprints that I could find. But when I walked over to where I thought I'd heard the steps, I found something. My knife. It was sticking out of a log, blade down. Clean. Planted perfectly upright in the wood, like someone had pressed it in there deliberately. The handle was still dry, no dew, no dirt, like it hadn't been there all night. I didn't touch it. I packed up in under 10 minutes. Just shoved everything in my bag, took down the bear line, didn't even bother rolling the tent up properly. I kept looking around the trees, waiting to see someone step out. No one did. As I started back toward the main trail, I passed that log again. The knife was gone. I hadn't heard anyone take it. Hadn't seen a thing. I didn't stop once during the hike out. 4.5 miles, straight through. I only drank water once I got to my car. I don't know who it was, or what they wanted. But they had a chance to take anything, my wallet, my food, even my whole pack. They didn't. They took the knife, waited, then gave it back. And I don't think it was meant to be a favor. I went up to Lake Danby for a solo weekend. It's about a 3-hour drive from where I live, not super remote, but enough to feel like you're out there. No cell signal once you're past the ranger station. I'd been there once before with a friend, and I remembered a little peninsula that stuck out into the lake where you could camp without seeing anyone else. It had a great view across the water, fire pit already set up, and it felt tucked away without being too deep into the woods. I parked at the main lot, hiked the 3 miles in with my pack, and got there just before dusk on Friday. No other cars in the lot when I arrived. I set up my tent, filtered water, and had a simple dinner, trail mix, jerky, that kind of thing. I was in the tent by 9. Pretty uneventful. Saturday morning, I woke up early and walked the perimeter of the lake with my camera. I saw a couple loons, got some decent shots, and circled back to camp around 11. That was the first time I noticed a guy. He was across the lake, probably a few hundred yards away, standing right at the tree line. It was one of those spots where the trees grow right up to the water, no beach or rocks or anything. He was just standing there, facing my direction. I couldn't make out much detail because of the distance, but it looked like he was wearing a hooded jacket, dark pants. Not moving. At first I thought maybe it was another camper who just wandered down to the edge to look at the lake. I went about my business, made some instant coffee, sat on a log near the fire ring, checked my map to plan a day hike. 20 minutes later, I glanced back across and he was still there. Same exact spot. Same posture. I got this weird feeling then. Not fear, just something. I watched for a bit longer. He didn't seem to be doing anything. No camera. No fishing gear. Just standing. I tried waving, even held a hand up like a wave and then shrugged, like what's up? No response. Eventually I went back into the woods for a few hours. I followed a side trail that looped around a ridge above the lake. I didn't see anyone else. No hikers, no tents, nothing. When I got back to camp a little before 4, he was gone. There wasn't much daylight left, so I gathered wood and started a small fire. I kept glancing across the lake but didn't see anything unusual. Around dusk, I was cooking a little rice and tuna on my stove when I spotted movement through the trees across the water. I paused, squinted, and saw him again, same place, same guy. But this time, he was holding something up to his face. It took me a second to realize it was binoculars. He was watching me. Not just facing in my direction, but clearly and deliberately watching me. I froze for a second. I had this dumb moment of maybe he's birdwatching, like my brain was trying to make it normal. But there were no birds out right then, no movement at all. It was just me and him. Me by my fire, him in the shadows across the lake, staring. I put out my stove and sat behind my tent where I couldn't be seen. I stayed there a long time. Maybe an hour. When I peeked out again, he hadn't moved. I kept telling myself maybe he was just weird. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he was watching something else. The binoculars didn't move. Neither did he. When it was fully dark, he finally turned and walked back into the trees. No flashlight. No sound. Just gone. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking I'd hear him walking around my camp. I kept my headlamp and knife beside me in the tent. I didn't even zip the sleeping bag, just laid on top of it, fully dressed. Every tiny sound outside made me tense up. But nothing happened. The next morning, I packed up fast. I didn't eat. I just took down the tent, threw everything in my pack, and headed out. I didn't want to risk taking the trail past his side of the lake, so I followed the longer loop that goes around the other way. It added an extra mile or two, but I didn't care. About halfway out, I stopped to rest. There's a spot with a little overlook where you can see the lake through the trees. I looked down, and there he was again, standing right at the water, same exact place as before, binoculars up, even though I was almost a mile away and way above him. I was barely visible through the branches, but he was looking right at me. He had followed me out there. Or maybe he never left. I don't know. But he was watching again. I got up and kept moving. Didn't rest again until I was back at the trailhead. Still no other cars. Still no cell signal. I drove the entire way home without stopping. The whole weekend I didn't see a single other person in that park. Just him. Watching. Not speaking. Not doing anything. Just watching. I'd been looking forward to this solo camping trip for weeks. Just me, the woods, and a few days of peace and quiet. I found a small, secluded campground that was just off a quiet highway, far enough away from civilization but still close enough to get to without too much of a trek. The drive was long, but I didn't mind. I always liked the feeling of getting away, especially when I didn't have to share the space with anyone. I rolled into the campground around 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. The sun was just starting to dip, casting long shadows through the trees. There were only a handful of tents set up, which was exactly what I was hoping for. I picked a spot near the edge of the site, right next to a small creek, and started setting up. It was peaceful. Almost too peaceful, if I'm being honest, but I chalked that up to it being off-season for camping. After I had my tent set up and the fire started, I was feeling pretty good. I figured I'd get some dinner going and just relax for the evening. That's when I heard voices coming from a couple of sites down. 3 people, 2 guys and a girl, were walking toward me, carrying a couple of beers and a backpack. They seemed friendly enough. The woman, in particular, waved and called out to me. "Hey! You camping alone?" she asked as she got closer. "Yeah, just a solo trip," I said, flashing a smile. "Seems like you're the only other ones here." "We're just getting started," one of the guys, taller with dark hair, said. "You should join us for a drink. We've got some food, too." I wasn't really in the mood to hang out with strangers, but they seemed harmless enough. I didn't want to be rude, so I agreed. They set up a little fire pit next to theirs, and soon enough, we were all sitting around, chatting. The woman, Sarah, asked me about where I was from and what I was doing out there alone. The other guy, Ben, kept telling jokes, while the third guy, Mark, mostly listened, nodding along every so often. The conversation was easy at first. We all traded stories about our past camping trips, and I was genuinely enjoying myself. But after a little while, the tone started to shift. At first, it was subtle, a comment here and there about how it must be nice to be out in the woods all alone. Then they started asking more personal questions, like where I was really from, what I did for a living. Things that felt just a little too pointed. I didn't think much of it at first, but the questions kept coming. "So, you don't have a girlfriend or anything, huh?" Ben asked, leaning back on his hands, his voice a little too casual. "Nope, just me and the trees," I said, trying to keep it light. "You ever feel, like, weird out here by yourself? I mean, you're just alone in the woods, right?" Mark said, his voice slow, like he was letting the words settle in. I laughed it off. I've camped alone before. I actually prefer it. But the way they were looking at me made me uncomfortable. They weren't laughing. They were watching me too closely, like they were studying my reactions. Every so often, their eyes would flick over to each other, like they were silently communicating. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the way they interacted felt off. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to seem rude. The night wore on, and the fire was starting to die down. I figured it was time to get some sleep, so I stood up. I'm gonna head back to my tent. Thanks for the drink. No problem, man. You sure you don't want to stay? Ben called after me. We're gonna hang out for a bit longer. I waved it off, trying to sound casual. Nah, I'm good. I've got an early morning tomorrow. I made my way back to my campsite, feeling the night air grow colder. As I was walking, I heard them laughing behind me, but it didn't sound as carefree as before. It almost felt like they were laughing at me. I got back to my tent and zipped it up, feeling a little uneasy, but I tried to shake it off. I went to grab my keys from the small pouch on the inside of my tent, where I always kept them, but when I felt around, they weren't there. My stomach dropped. I reached deeper into the bag, checking every pocket. Still nothing. Panic started to creep in. I checked the ground around my tent, thinking maybe I had dropped them by accident, but no luck. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I must have left them in my car. But when I stepped outside and walked over to my car, I froze. Both of my tires on the driver's side were flat. And not just flat, completely slashed. I felt my heart start to race. The only people anywhere near here were the 3 campers from the other site, and it hit me all at once. They had to be the ones who'd done this. But why? What were they trying to do? I stood there for a few moments, trying to process, but my thoughts were all over the place. I knew I needed to get out of there. My car wasn't going anywhere with those tires, and I had no keys to get into it. I had a phone, but there was no service out here. My only option was to leave on foot. I grabbed my flashlight, stuffed it into my jacket pocket, and tried to stay calm. I didn't want to think about what they might do next. I took off down the path toward the main road, walking as quickly as I could without drawing attention to myself. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the trees, sent my heart into overdrive. I walked for what felt like forever, but eventually, I reached a small gas station about 5 miles down the road. I was exhausted, scared, and my hands were shaking as I called the police. I didn't know what to tell them. There wasn't much they could do. They took my statement, but without evidence, they couldn't exactly arrest anyone. All I could do was wait for a tow truck to come and take my car. I never went back to that campground. I don't know what their intentions were, but I can't shake the feeling that if I hadn't left when I did, things would have been much worse. I don't camp alone anymore. I can't. I had been hiking for hours that day, heading to a secluded campsite I'd found online. The whole point of this trip was to get away from people, so when I pulled into the small trailhead parking lot, I didn't expect to see anyone else there. It was a Tuesday, so I figured most people would be at work, and the last thing I wanted was to share a campsite with strangers. I grabbed my pack, locked my car, and followed the narrow trail that led deep into the woods. The air was cool, and the silence felt almost too thick, like it was waiting for something. The further I hiked, the more I started to notice how quiet it was. No birds, no rustling animals, nothing. The kind of quiet that starts to get uncomfortable after a while, but I didn't think too much of it. I'd been on plenty of solo hikes, and I'd gotten used to the quiet, even if it was a little eerie. After about an hour of walking, I found the site. It wasn't much, just a small clearing with a fire ring and a perfect spot for my tent. I set up camp, made some food, and spent the evening just sitting by the fire, watching the last bits of sunlight dip behind the trees. It was peaceful, and I had that sense of relief you get when you're far enough away from everything that it feels like time slows down. As night fell, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and settled in. The quiet out there in the woods was almost oppressive, but at the same time, I felt safe. I don't know how long I'd been lying there, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it. Breathing. At first, I thought it was just my own heavy breathing, maybe from the hike, but it was too rhythmic. Too steady. It wasn't coming from inside my tent, but it was so close, just outside. I froze, straining to hear it better. It wasn't loud, but it was heavy. Slow, like someone who'd been running and was catching their breath. I felt my heart rate pick up. I'd heard about people being stalked in the woods before, hikers, campers, but I'd always brushed those stories off as paranoia. Still, there was something so unsettling about it. I didn't dare move or make a sound, but I couldn't stop listening to that breathing. It was there, and it felt like it was waiting. I finally forced myself to call out. "Hey, is someone out there?" The breathing stopped. Just like that. No rustling. No movement. Just the dead silence of the forest again. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I called out again. "Hello?" My voice was shaky. Nothing. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. I felt like I was being watched. The air felt thicker now, the shadows outside my tent somehow darker. I lay there, staring at the tent ceiling, listening. Every little noise seemed amplified now, the wind shaking the branches, the crackle of my sleeping bag, the tiny sounds of my own breath. But nothing else. No more footsteps, no more breathing. Eventually, I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I had been too tired, too on edge from the hike. After a while, I finally drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't peaceful. Every time I stirred, I could still feel the tension in the air, like something wasn't quite right. Morning came, and I woke up feeling groggy, like I hadn't rested at all. I crawled out of the tent, the cold morning air biting at my skin. The campsite looked normal. No signs of anyone being there, no footsteps around my tent or near the fire ring. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I made some coffee and sat by the fire, trying to push the weirdness of the night out of my mind. I told myself that I was just being paranoid. But then I noticed something. The campfire ring was a mess. I hadn't left it like that. The ashes were scattered, like someone had messed with it during the night, and there was a broken branch on the ground next to it that didn't belong there. I didn't remember seeing it when I set up the night before. The pit in my stomach grew. Maybe it was a wild animal, but no. It didn't make sense. Animals don't mess with fires like that. This felt more like someone had been there. Someone who had been close enough to hear me call out, yet stayed hidden, waiting for me to fall asleep again. I packed up my gear, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. Every shadow seemed like it was hiding something. I hurried to break down the tent, trying to keep calm, but every second felt stretched out. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing. The walk back to the car felt like it took forever. I kept hearing things behind me, branches snapping, footsteps that didn't belong to me, but when I turned around, there was nothing. I didn't look back again until I reached the parking lot. When I got there, I noticed something strange. My car was parked just the way I'd left it, but the door handle had been tampered with. It wasn't much, just a tiny scratch next to the handle, but I knew it hadn't been there the night before. I didn't stick around long enough to try to figure out if there was a logical explanation. I tossed my stuff into the car, slammed the door, and left. I didn't go back to the woods after that. Not for a long time. And I still don't know what it was, whether it was someone messing with me, or just my mind playing tricks. But I'm sure of one thing, someone was out there, watching me. And I didn't stick around to find out who. I've done a fair amount of solo camping in my time. There's something about being out in nature by yourself that gives you a sense of peace, even if it's a little isolating. This trip was no different. I picked a quiet spot near a small river up in the mountains, far from any other campsites, and set up my tent for a few nights. The first day went fine. I spent most of it just wandering around, collecting firewood, taking in the silence. No one else was nearby, and that's exactly how I liked it. By night, I had a fire going, roasted some marshmallows, and then crawled into my tent to sleep. The usual. But on the second day, things started feeling a little off. It wasn't anything major at first. The weather was still great, the sun out, the birds chirping. But the silence? It was different. When I woke up that morning, everything felt muffled, like I was in a dream. I pushed it aside as nothing. I was in the woods alone. After all, quiet was to be expected. I went about my day like normal, collecting more firewood. The place I was camping in was thick with trees, so there was plenty of dry wood to be found. I walked maybe a quarter of a mile from the campsite, not too far. I'd been there before, just walking around looking for wood, and it always felt safe. But today, something made me uncomfortable. It wasn't like I heard anything. It wasn't the air or the wind. It was just off. As I bent down to pick up a few branches, I noticed something strange in the ground. It wasn't just a patch of dirt, no, it was like the earth had been disturbed recently. I knelt down, brushing the dirt away, and saw that it had been dug out, maybe a foot deep, and was kind of misshapen. It wasn't a hole someone would dig for firewood or for any kind of practical reason. It looked more like a shallow pit, hastily dug, like someone had wanted to cover something up quickly. I got this chill in my spine that made me hesitate, but I shook it off. It could have just been an animal. Sometimes, wildlife dig up the ground like that. Still, it didn't sit right with me. I stood up and glanced around, scanning the trees and the surrounding area. The woods were eerily quiet, but nothing looked out of place. No signs of people, no other tents or campsites in sight. I was about to leave when I noticed something else, just a few feet away from the pit. It was a tarp. At first, it just looked like a regular piece of old, weathered tarp that might have been discarded by some camper. But when I got closer, I saw the stains. Red, dark stains that looked too fresh to be something that had been lying there for long. I felt my heart start to race. This wasn't right. It wasn't the kind of thing I could ignore. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I was frozen. I slowly bent down to take a closer look at the tarp, but then I heard something in the distance, a rustling sound in the trees, like someone walking. I froze again, straining to listen. The rustling stopped. I didn't hear footsteps, but I felt something. Like someone was standing still, watching me. My skin went cold. I glanced quickly around, but there was nothing. Just the trees. Nothing in sight. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I backed away slowly, my eyes still on the tarp and the pit. My thoughts were racing now. Had someone else been camping here? Or worse, were they still nearby? I kept thinking of the pit, the way it was dug so hastily, the tarp, the blood stains. The sense of being watched wouldn't go away. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I didn't want to stick around to find out what it all meant. I turned and headed back towards my camp, walking quickly, trying not to break into a run. I felt this need to just get out of there. When I got back to the camp, I checked everything, my food, my gear, my tent. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the air still felt wrong. The place was too quiet, too still. The rest of the afternoon went by, but I couldn't shake that feeling. I kept glancing over my shoulder, wondering if someone was out there, watching me. The sun was setting, and I decided it was time to start the fire. At least that would give me some light, some warmth, something that felt real. But even as I sat by the fire, I couldn't relax. I kept staring into the trees, waiting for a movement I knew wasn't there. I hadn't been to the area where I'd found the pit for a few hours, but by evening, the urge to go back there started creeping up on me again. I had to know. I couldn't let it go. It was stupid, but I had to check it one more time. So I grabbed my flashlight and my knife, just in case. I didn't think it would come to that, but after the pit and the tarp, I wasn't taking any chances. When I got to the spot again, the feeling of dread hit me even harder. The pit was exactly as I'd left it, but the tarp was gone. I stared at the spot where it had been, trying to make sense of it. The ground where the tarp had been wasn't disturbed, no footprints, no drag marks. Nothing. It was like it had never been there. I swallowed hard and turned to leave. That's when I heard the sound again, the rustling in the trees. This time, I wasn't imagining it. I could tell someone was there. The faintest crunch of a branch, the softest shuffle of feet. I wasn't going to wait around to see who it was. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, back towards the campsite, not stopping until I was inside my tent, zipped up tight. I didn't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I wasn't going to give them the chance to find out. I packed up my stuff first thing in the morning, barely even stopping to make coffee. I didn't want to be in those woods a minute longer than I had to be. When I finally reached my car, I looked around one last time, feeling like someone was still watching me. I didn't see anyone, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I left the mountains that day, and I didn't look back. I don't know who dug that pit or why they left the tarp behind. But I know one thing for sure, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I went camping alone a few months ago in a secluded spot by a lake. I'd been there before, but it had been a while. It was the perfect place to get away from everything for a couple of days. No cell service, no distractions, just trees, water, and silence. That was the plan, anyway. The first day was nice. I set up my tent by the water, unpacked my stuff, and went for a long walk through the woods. It was calm. I didn't see a single person the entire day, which is exactly what I wanted. The place was remote, but not too far out, just far enough that you knew you'd be alone, but close enough to not feel like you were risking your life. That night, I got a fire going and spent a couple of hours just staring into it, listening to the crackling sounds and the night noises around me. There was no one else around as far as I could tell, which made it even more peaceful. I was starting to drift off around midnight when I heard something. It was faint at first, like a distant laugh. I thought I might have imagined it, but then I heard it again, a little clearer this time. It wasn't a loud, boisterous laugh. It was almost like a quiet chuckle, but it was coming from somewhere nearby. I figured it was probably another camper, maybe just having a late-night conversation around a campfire of their own. It wasn't uncommon, especially in a camping spot like that. Still, I couldn't help but feel a little weird about it. I shrugged it off. There were other people in the area, sure, but it wasn't like I was alone in the woods. It was late, but I thought it was probably just a few people enjoying the evening. But then it came again. A laugh, this time a little louder and closer. It wasn't a friendly, relaxed kind of laugh either. It sounded almost nervous, like someone trying to be quiet, but failing. It wasn't right. I didn't know why, but it just didn't sit well with me. It wasn't a laugh I would hear from someone enjoying a good time. It had this eerie quality to it, like they were trying to be sneaky. I turned over in my sleeping bag, hoping it would stop. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me. I tried to ignore it, but the laughter kept coming. It wasn't constant, but it would pop up every few minutes, like it was coming from somewhere close by, just far enough that I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. I lay there for a while, listening to it, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was someone else's campfire, just a little too close. But that laugh kept nagging at me. It was too quiet to be someone just having fun, and it was too erratic. Almost as if someone was trying to hide but couldn't keep it together. I could hear the rustling of leaves, like they were moving around, shifting spots, maybe walking closer. The longer it went on, the more unsettled I became. I had a bad feeling in my gut. I don't know if it was because of the laugh itself or the fact that whoever was out there was making an effort to stay hidden, but something didn't feel right. I grabbed my flashlight, deciding to at least peek outside my tent, see if I could catch a glimpse of whoever was out there. I wasn't planning on confronting anyone, just checking. I unzipped the door slowly and peered into the dark, but the flashlight didn't reveal anything. No movement. The trees were still. I couldn't even hear the laughter anymore. Everything felt too quiet. I stayed up for a while after that, not really able to sleep. I kept listening, but the laughter didn't come back. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to every little noise in the woods. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my heart race. The next morning, I was more than ready to get out of the tent. The sun was up, the birds were out, and it seemed like a peaceful day. Still, I couldn't let go of the odd feeling from the night before. I decided to go check out the area where I'd heard the laughter. I packed up a small day pack with some water and snacks and set off into the woods, hoping to find some sign of who'd been out there. Maybe they'd left a campfire or something. I walked for about half an hour, making my way through the trees towards where I thought I had heard the noise. The area was quiet now, but something still felt off. It wasn't the same as before, though. It wasn't the same eerie silence, it was a more regular kind of quiet. When I finally reached the spot where I thought the camp might have been, there was nothing. No signs of a fire. No tents. No trash or anything that would indicate someone had been camping there. There wasn't even a footprint in the dirt. I looked around carefully, trying to make sense of it. I was certain the laugh had come from somewhere close by the night before. But now, it was like nothing had been there at all. I walked around the area for a while, scanning the trees, looking for anything that would tell me someone had been there. But nothing. The ground was untouched, the forest completely still. I stood there for a while, trying to figure it out. Maybe I had heard the sound from a distance, and it had just been carried by the wind. But no, that didn't feel right. It was too close. Too clear. The laugh had been real. It had come from somewhere nearby. I went back to my campsite after that, a little unnerved but still not ready to pack up and leave. It wasn't like I'd found anything that made me think I was in immediate danger, but the whole situation was starting to get to me. The night before, the laughter, it was just too strange. Too out of place. I spent the rest of the day keeping an eye on the area, but nothing happened. The rest of the night passed without incident. The wind was quiet, the trees still, and I didn't hear a single laugh. I left the next morning, packed up my things, and got out of there. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that spot. Something about it just doesn't sit right with me. The laughter, the feeling of being watched, and then finding nothing. It was all just too strange. I don't know who was out there, or what they were doing, but I know I didn't want to stick around to find out. I never planned on going camping alone, but sometimes life gets to be a bit too much, and I just needed to get away for a weekend. It wasn't far from the city, just a couple of hours up in the mountains. I figured I'd find a quiet spot near a lake, pitch my tent, and forget about everything for a couple of days. The first day was great. I found a perfect spot to set up camp, just by the edge of a small, serene lake. The weather was perfect, not too hot, not too cold. I spent the afternoon walking around, exploring the area, just soaking it all in. I didn't see anyone else all day. It was just me and the trees. As evening started to set in, I made a fire and cooked some food. Everything was peaceful, too peaceful, almost. I was tired but didn't want to go to bed too early. So I stayed up, watching the flames, listening to the sound of the night around me. The usual nighttime noises of the forest, the rustling of leaves, distant animal calls, the crackling of the fire kept me company. It was getting late when I first heard him. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe some animal moving through the trees. But then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet but wasn't doing a very good job of it. The footsteps were getting closer, and I froze. I wasn't sure what to do. It didn't seem like anyone should be out there. I hadn't seen anyone all day, and this wasn't a common camping spot, at least, not as far as I knew. I looked around, but there was no one. Then, out of nowhere, a man appeared. He was stumbling through the trees toward me, looking disoriented. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, and wearing old, torn clothes. His hair was matted, and his face was pale, almost like he hadn't been sleeping. He didn't look like someone who was out on a nice hike, that's for sure. "Hey," he said, his voice shaking a little. "I'm lost. I don't know how I got here. Can I sit for a minute?" Before I could even respond, he sat down on the ground by the fire, too close for comfort. His eyes darted around the camp, like he was looking for something or someone. His breathing was rapid, and there was a nervousness about him that set me on edge. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to sound casual but definitely not feeling casual. "How'd you end up out here?" He didn't answer right away. He just kept looking over his shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone was following him. I noticed his hands were shaking. He kept wiping them on his pants, like he couldn't stop. "Someone's following me," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who, but I can feel them. They're watching me." He glanced at me like I should have understood exactly what he meant, but I didn't. "Okay," I said, trying to process what he was saying. Are you hurt? Do you need help? I don't know, he muttered. I need to stay here for a while. Please. I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me wanted to tell him to leave, but he looked so damn scared, I couldn't bring myself to do it. The way he kept glancing around, checking over his shoulder, made me think there was something more to this. Maybe he was just lost. Maybe he was just scared. But something in my gut told me that wasn't the whole story. I gave him some water, tried to calm him down a little, but he wouldn't relax. He kept saying the same thing, that someone was following him, and that they were close. Look, I don't know if I can help you, I said, starting to feel uncomfortable. Maybe you should head back to town. There's a ranger station not far from here. They could. No, he interrupted, a little too quickly. No, I can't go back there. They'll find me. He looked down at the ground, then back up at me, his eyes wide. Please, I need to stay here. I can't leave. There was something off about the way he was acting. Something desperate. I started to wonder if he was on something. Or maybe he'd been in the woods for too long, and his mind was starting to go. But he wasn't asking to sleep by the fire or crash in the tent. I noticed that right away. Instead, he kept staring at my tent like he was eyeing it as a safe place. Listen, I said, trying to keep calm. If you're really lost, I'll help you. But you can't just sit here all night. It's not safe. He nodded quickly, like he understood, but he didn't move. He just sat there, hands clasped tight in his lap, eyes darting every which way. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped in my own campsite, unable to get rid of this guy, but also not wanting to make things worse by escalating the situation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't telling me the whole truth. There was something in the way he kept looking around, something in his eyes that made me feel like I was part of a situation that was way bigger than just a lost guy in the woods. After what felt like an eternity, he suddenly stood up without warning. I need to go in your tent, he said, his voice trembling. Please. I didn't know what to say. The request was so strange, and everything about this guy was making me more and more uneasy. He was clearly in some kind of panic mode, and I didn't know what he would do if I said no. No, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You can't come in my tent. He stared at me for a long time, and then, without a word, he slowly started to walk toward the tent anyway. His eyes were fixed on it, and I could see that he wasn't asking anymore. He was demanding. I stood up quickly, putting myself between him and the tent. No, you need to leave, I said, my voice sharper now. This is my space. You can't just. But he wasn't listening. He reached out toward the zipper of the tent, and that's when I snapped. I pushed him back, harder than I meant to. Leave, I said again, louder this time. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with confusion, then fear. For a second, I thought he might do something violent. But then he just stood there, staring at me, breathing heavily. I'm sorry, he said, voice shaking. I thought they'd. Before I could say anything else, he turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the trees so quickly I barely had time to react. I stood there for a long time after, wondering what the hell had just happened. I kept waiting for him to come back, but he didn't. The fire crackled, the night air chilled, and for the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there watching me. The next morning, I packed up as quickly as I could and got out of there. I didn't see him again, and I didn't want to. Something about that encounter didn't sit right, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what would happen next. I was out for a walk one afternoon. It was just a regular day, the kind where you don't expect anything strange to happen. I'd been trying to get into the habit of walking more, clearing my head, so I figured I'd take the long route that passed through an old park near the edge of town. It wasn't a park that saw a lot of traffic, mostly because it was kind of run down and overgrown with weeds. But that was part of why I liked it. There was a quiet, peaceful solitude there, something you didn't get in the busier parts of town. I was walking along the dirt path when something caught my eye. It was a wallet, half buried in the dirt just off the side of the trail. At first, I thought it was just trash. People always left stuff behind, especially around this park, so I didn't think much of it. But when I bent down to pick it up, I noticed the leather was still in decent shape, not something that had been lying out for ages. I opened it, and there was a driver's license inside. A guy named Rick Stanton, from out of state, somewhere far, like 2 or 3 states away. The wallet was thin, just a couple of cards and some cash. No pictures or anything personal, which felt weird. I figured someone had probably dropped it on their way through, and that maybe I'd find the owner if I contacted the place on the ID. Still, something about the whole thing felt a little off. I didn't want to just leave it there, though, so I slipped it in my pocket, planning on looking up the number when I got home. As I continued walking, I found myself distracted by the wallet. I kept thinking about how it had ended up there. The park wasn't exactly a common spot for tourists or out-of-towners to stop. It was the kind of place you'd only know about if you were local or if you were somewhere you shouldn't have been. My thoughts started to wander, and I didn't notice the small indentation in the ground ahead of me until I almost stepped on it. I stopped, looking down. The dirt had been disturbed, like someone had scraped away a small patch and then tried to cover it back up. Curiosity got the best of me, and I knelt down to inspect it. The hole wasn't deep, but it was definitely there. As I poked at the dirt with my fingers, something hard caught on one of them. I pulled it out carefully. It was another wallet. This one was old, worn out, like it had been buried for a while. I couldn't believe it. This was a random spot in the park, nowhere near any kind of popular area. I didn't want to get too weirded out, but I felt my stomach drop a little. I flipped it open. Same deal as the first one: ID, some cards, a little cash. This time, though, the ID was from a different state, not far, but still not local. I wasn't sure what to make of it. It felt too odd, like too much of a coincidence. I glanced around, half expecting someone to pop out from behind the trees or the bushes. But there was nothing. Just the wind rustling the leaves and the quiet sound of birds in the distance. I set the wallet aside and stood up, looking around. But that's when I noticed something else, a slight depression in the ground near a nearby tree. The kind of thing you might miss if you weren't paying attention. Without thinking, I walked over to it and started digging a little, just with my hands. It was all soft, sandy dirt, loose and easy to dig through. It didn't take long before I found something else. This time it was a phone. Not a brand new one, but still relatively modern. It was scratched up, definitely used, but it didn't look like it had been up there for too long. I had no idea what to think. At this point, the feeling that something wasn't right was creeping up on me. I pulled the phone out and held it in my hand, staring at the screen. It was cracked, but it powered on. The wallpaper was a photo of a woman and a child, smiling. There were a few notifications, but nothing that seemed urgent. I turned the phone over, and the back was scratched up too, like it had been dropped a bunch of times. I didn't know what I was doing, whether I should be checking it for something useful, or just leaving it alone, but I kept staring at it, wondering what the hell was going on. Then I saw it. Another shallow hole, maybe 3 or 4 feet from where I dug up the phone. I walked over and bent down, scraping away more dirt with my hands. I found another wallet. And then another. And another. Each one was different, old, worn out, the kind of stuff that didn't belong out here in the woods. I don't know how many I found, maybe 5, maybe 6, but they all had the same thing in common. They were all from different states. And none of them seemed like they'd been there for long. The more I dug, the more I realized what I was looking at, a collection. Someone had buried these things here on purpose. Not just lost stuff that had been forgotten, but items that were carefully hidden. The thought of it made me feel sick. I started to panic, my heart racing, and I realized I was shaking. Something about it felt like a trap. I stopped digging. I didn't know who had done this or why, but I didn't want to find out. The thought that someone had been watching me, or worse, that they were still nearby, made my skin crawl. I tried to stay calm, but the more I thought about it, the worse it felt. The wallets, the phones, the sense that I wasn't alone. I stood up quickly, looking around again. I don't know why, but I had this overwhelming sense that there was someone out there, just out of sight, waiting. I took one last glance at the hole where I'd found all the wallets, and then I started walking fast. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, telling myself I was overthinking it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My mind was racing as I walked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it some kind of weird coincidence? Or had I stumbled onto something much worse? I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, far from the park. It was only then that I let myself take a breath and try to calm down. I didn't know what to do with the wallets I'd found, or why they were there. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going back to that park. And if I never saw those things again, it'd be too soon. It was supposed to be just a normal weekend hike. My buddy, Eric, and I had been talking about hitting some trails for a while, so we finally picked a spot about an hour outside of town. It wasn't a busy trail, mostly locals went there, and it wasn't on any major maps, which was part of the appeal. It was more quiet and secluded, and that's how we liked it. The first couple of miles went fine. We talked about work, caught up on life stuff. I was mostly focused on the hike itself, the feeling of the dirt trail under my boots, the sound of the birds and wind in the trees. The place was beautiful, thick forest, tall trees, some streams, the kind of nature that made you feel small in the best way possible. We stopped for a break by a stream. I sat on a rock, took out a water bottle, and just listened to the water flowing, the birds overhead. Eric had his phone out, probably checking the map or texting someone. He didn't notice it first, but I did. A rustling noise. Not the kind of light, wind-blown rustling you get from leaves. This was something heavier. Like someone or something pushing through the brush. I looked around. Didn't see anything. I thought it was probably some animal. A deer or a raccoon, maybe. But then I heard it again. And this time, I caught a glimpse of movement in the trees, something black, darting between the trunks. I pointed it out to Eric. He squinted in the direction I was looking, but by then, whatever it was had disappeared again. Probably just someone else on the trail, he said, taking a sip from his water bottle. Yeah, maybe, I said, but I wasn't convinced. The movement had been too fast, too deliberate. And it felt off. Like it wasn't just a hiker passing by. We didn't say much after that. We just kept walking, the uneasy feeling sitting between us. But the further we went, the more it felt like we weren't alone. I kept hearing rustling in the bushes, just out of sight. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something dark moving in the trees, but when I turned my head to get a better look, it was always gone. I tried to shake it off. We'd been hiking for hours, after all. My mind was probably just playing tricks on me. But then, we heard footsteps. Soft at first, but they were getting closer. Slow and steady, like someone was trying to stay hidden. Eric and I both stopped, and the footsteps stopped too. The forest was quiet again, except for the wind. We stood there, staring at each other. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I didn't want to turn around, but I felt like I had to. "That's not an animal," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Eric didn't reply. He just gave me this weird, nervous look. He was trying to stay calm, but I could see it in his eyes. He was feeling it too. Then, we both heard something different. A faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking. It was coming from behind us, and it was getting louder, closer. I wanted to turn around, but I didn't. I didn't want to see who or what was back there. I just knew it wasn't good. "Dude, I think we should get out of here," Eric said finally, his voice low. "Let's just head back to the car." I nodded, and we started walking faster, but the sound of footsteps didn't go away. It followed us. Slow, deliberate, like someone was right behind us but never catching up. I kept checking over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just trees, just shadows. We were maybe 15 minutes from the trailhead when I heard it. The sound of something heavy being dragged through the underbrush. I froze, my stomach dropping. I glanced over at Eric. He was looking at me, his face pale. "Go," I hissed, and we both broke into a run. The sound of the dragging stopped, but the footsteps started again. Faster now. Someone was chasing us. I didn't look back this time. I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my chest as we pushed through the trees, jumping over roots and rocks, trying to make it to the end of the trail. My legs were burning, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get to the car and leave. Then, I saw it. A figure darted between two trees ahead of us, dressed entirely in black. I only caught a glimpse of him, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. He wasn't just running through the woods. He was moving with purpose, almost like he knew exactly where we were going. I felt a jolt of panic shoot through me. This wasn't just some guy hiking. This was someone who was actively following us, maybe even hunting us. I heard Eric shout something ahead of me, but I couldn't make it out. I was too focused on the figure, now standing in front of us. He was holding something, a machete, I think, though I didn't want to get too close to confirm. He was standing still, just watching us. Eric stopped next to me, gasping for breath. We were trapped. We didn't say anything. We just stared at the man in black. He wasn't moving, but he wasn't backing off either. The machete glinted in the weak light filtering through the trees, and I could hear the faint sound of his breathing, steady and calm, almost like he wasn't worried at all. "Who the hell are you?" Eric finally managed to choke out. The guy didn't answer. He just stood there. And for a moment, everything was completely still. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my hands shaking, but I knew we couldn't stay here. I didn't care if he had a weapon. I wasn't going to just stand around and wait to find out what he wanted. Without saying a word, I grabbed Eric by the arm and started running again, dragging him along with me. We pushed through the trees, not looking back, not stopping, not caring if the guy was following us. I'm not sure how long we ran, but eventually we came to the end of the trail, and there it was, the parking lot. I didn't even wait for Eric. I ran straight to my car, yanked open the door, and jumped in. Eric wasn't far behind. He slammed the door shut, and I started the engine without thinking. We didn't speak as I pulled out of the lot and sped down the road. We didn't stop until we were miles away. By then, the adrenaline had worn off, and we both just sat there in silence, trying to catch our breath. I don't know who that guy was, or why he was out there with a machete. I don't know what he wanted from us. But I do know one thing: I'm never going hiking there again. I was sitting at the edge of the trail, just trying to catch my breath. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and everything was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves. My friend Jake had gone off to use the bathroom about 20 minutes ago, and I was starting to get a little impatient. Not that I'd say anything, I was the one who always took my time. But we'd been hiking for a while, and I was ready to start heading back to the car. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no texts from Jake. That was weird. I figured maybe he was just taking his time, but something about the silence felt a little off. I called him, just to check in. No answer. I shrugged it off and went back to staring at the trail ahead. But then, a few minutes later, my phone buzzed. A text. From Jake. I opened it. It was short and to the point. Don't look for me. I froze. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, convinced I was misreading it. I looked at the name again. Yep. Jake. It was definitely from his number. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with that. Was he joking? It didn't sound like him, not even a little bit. I called him again. This time, it rang. Then it went to voicemail. The silence after that felt heavier. I felt like I couldn't move, like the weight of everything around me was pressing in. I checked the time again, 20 minutes since he'd left. I was starting to feel like something was wrong, but I tried to talk myself out of it. Maybe he just wanted some space, or he was messing with me. He was known for his pranks, though this felt different somehow. I stood up and walked over to where I'd last seen him leave the trail to go to the bathroom. The path was narrow and twisted around some large rocks, disappearing into the trees. It was getting darker now, and I couldn't make out much past a few feet. I was about to call him again when my phone buzzed once more. Same message. Don't look for me. Okay. That was it. I wasn't going to sit here anymore. I didn't care if he was pulling some stupid prank or whatever. Something didn't feel right. I turned around and started walking down the trail, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of him. It wasn't a long trail, but it was full of twists and turns. I walked for what felt like forever, but probably only lasted a few minutes. No sign of Jake. I tried calling again, just out of habit, even though I knew he wouldn't pick up. The call went to voicemail almost immediately. Something was definitely off now. My gut was telling me not to keep going, but my brain was telling me that I had to. I had to make sure he was okay. I wasn't going to just ignore that text. I took a few more steps down the trail, scanning the area. That's when I saw it. A branch had snapped off a tree, and there were fresh footprints leading off the main path and into the underbrush. They were big, Jake's size, or close to it. But they were all over the place. It looked like someone had been moving fast, stumbling, maybe. I followed them, keeping my distance, but there was no way I was going to get any closer. My heart was racing now. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. I kept thinking that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he'd just gotten lost. Maybe he'd taken a wrong turn. But this felt different, like there was something hiding just around the next corner. After another minute, I saw a dark shape on the ground through the trees. My stomach lurched. It was Jake's backpack, lying there in the dirt, half hidden under some branches. I couldn't see him. I couldn't see anything, just a pack. I stood there for a few seconds, my mind running wild. I didn't know what to do. It felt wrong to approach it, but I couldn't just leave either. I moved closer, cautiously. When I knelt down to check the backpack, I saw his water bottle, his jacket, and a granola bar. Everything looked untouched, like he just dropped it and walked away. That's when I heard the noise. It was faint, but it was there, a rustling sound, like something moving quickly through the brush. My breath caught in my throat, and my first thought was to run. But something made me stop, just for a second. I didn't turn around, didn't look back. Then, my phone buzzed again. Same text. Same message. Don't look for me. This time, it felt like a warning. Like whatever was out here with me knew exactly what I was doing. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing behind me, but there was nothing. I needed to leave. I needed to go back to the trailhead. But that nagging feeling in the back of my head wouldn't let me. What if Jake was in trouble? What if he was hurt or trapped somewhere? What if I didn't go after him and something happened? I called out. Jake, you out here? Nothing. Not a sound, not a whisper of movement. I wasn't sure what to do next, so I just started walking back. I didn't want to go too far, but I didn't want to stay where I was either. As I walked back toward the main trail, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The kind of footsteps that didn't belong. They weren't from me, they weren't from Jake. They were someone else, walking in the same direction I was. The rustling of leaves underfoot was soft, like the person was trying to be quiet. I broke into a jog, trying to get back to the main trail. I needed to get out of there. But the footsteps kept up, staying just behind me, almost like they were following me. I wasn't looking back now, I couldn't. Every part of me wanted to just sprint, but I knew if I ran, I'd end up making things worse. I kept walking faster, and finally, I broke through the trees to the open trail. I could see the parking lot in the distance, the headlights of my car glowing faintly. I felt like I could breathe again, but I didn't stop. I kept walking as quickly as I could, my eyes darting back and forth, just waiting for someone to jump out at me. When I got back to the parking lot, I didn't even look at my phone. I just got in the car, started the engine, and left. I didn't go back to check on Jake. Something told me that if I went back to look, I'd find something I didn't want to. And I never heard from him again. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me and my brother, camping in one of the more secluded spots in the park. We'd been here a few times before, but this time felt different. The kind of quiet that wraps around you like a thick fog. The weather was perfect, not too hot or cold, just cool enough for a hoodie at night. We had set up camp in the usual spot, not too far from the trailhead but far enough to feel like we were alone. We spent the afternoon hiking, took in some views from the lookout point, and then started a fire to cook up dinner. The sun was setting, and it was one of those evenings where you just didn't want to move. The light was fading, and everything seemed to slow down. I was finishing up some trail mix when I heard the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was my brother walking around, maybe checking out the campsite or grabbing more wood. But then I looked up, and there was a man standing at the edge of our camp. He wasn't wearing hiking gear, just a khaki shirt, cargo pants, and a ranger hat. I thought maybe he was one of the park rangers doing a routine check, but it struck me as odd how he just appeared without a word, without any real introduction. "Evening," he said, looking at us both without smiling. His voice was calm, but there was something unsettling about it. "You're gonna need to pack up. You need to leave immediately." I looked at my brother, who had been sitting beside me, and he looked back at me, confused. "What do you mean? Is something wrong?" I asked, trying to read the guy. He didn't seem in a hurry, but the way he stood there, like he was waiting for us to move, didn't sit right with me. Bear sighting in the area. Unusual behavior. Not safe. "I'm here to get you out," he said, his gaze shifting toward the trees behind our tent. His eyes lingered there for a second longer than I was comfortable with. I glanced over at my brother, who was still just sitting there. "We're not really in danger, are we?" I asked, trying to sound casual. But the way this guy was talking, it wasn't like the usual warnings we'd gotten in the past. It was urgent, but also distant, like he didn't really care about what happened to us. The ranger stepped forward slightly. "Listen," he said, his tone shifting. "You need to leave now. I'm not asking. It's not safe here." At that point, I felt it. That little prickling sensation at the back of my neck. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the whole situation felt off. I stood up slowly, trying to keep things casual. "Okay, but I just want to confirm this with the station. I'm not sure why they wouldn't have called us or posted anything about it." I fished out my phone, still trying to keep the mood light, but there was a tightness in my chest I couldn't ignore now. The ranger didn't move, but his eyes darted back to the trees, and then to the ground. "That's not necessary. Just pack up." I made sure to keep my tone polite, but firm. "I'm gonna call the station. I'll pack up after I confirm this with them." He didn't respond at first. Just stood there, still watching me, as if waiting for me to change my mind. I stepped away a few feet to get some privacy and dialed the park station. It was a direct line to the ranger's office, and I expected to hear the usual voice on the other end. But when the phone picked up, it wasn't anyone I recognized. "Hello, this is Ranger Daniels. How can I help you?" "Hi, I'm at the campsite near the trailhead. I've got a ranger here telling me we need to leave. Something about a bear. Can you confirm that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Wait, you said you're at the trailhead? And a ranger told you to leave?" "Yeah, that's right. A guy in a khaki shirt and hat. He just showed up and told us to pack up." I could hear the sound of typing on the other end as Ranger Daniels checked something. "We didn't send anyone out there," he said, sounding confused. "There's no report of a bear sighting. And no rangers were assigned to that area tonight." My heart skipped a beat. "So, you didn't send anyone?" "No one's out there, ma'am." "Are you sure it was a ranger? It could have been someone impersonating one." I felt my stomach turn. "That's not possible, right? He was wearing the uniform. Where exactly are you? I need to know which camp you're at." I looked around for a moment and gave the location details, the coordinates of the campsite, and a few landmarks. Ranger Daniels confirmed the area and then said, "Stay where you are. Do not leave your campsite." I'll send someone to check on you. Before I could say anything else, the line went dead. I looked up at the man who had been standing by our fire. He was still there, just watching me. His expression hadn't changed at all, but something about his stance felt more rigid now. Almost like he was waiting for me to do something. I didn't wait for him to make the first move. I turned to my brother and said, "We're not going anywhere. Stay inside the tent and don't come out until I say it's safe." The ranger's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "You really think it's a good idea to stick around out here?" "I'm not leaving," I said, my voice a little firmer than I intended. "I'm waiting for backup." He didn't say anything for a while. He just stood there, staring at me, like he was trying to read me. Then, finally, he spoke. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said in a low, gravelly voice. It was like he was trying to convince me, but I didn't buy it. I could feel the tension building, and every fiber of my being told me to run. I didn't. I stood my ground. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of an engine in the distance, and I could see the headlights coming up the dirt road. The ranger stepped back, and I knew this was my moment. He wasn't supposed to be there. I had confirmation that no one was out there to evacuate us. But he didn't run. He didn't even seem worried. The headlights grew brighter as a Park Service vehicle pulled into the clearing. 2 rangers jumped out, both looking at the man standing near our fire. They didn't say anything at first, just looked him over. Then, one of them asked, "What are you doing here?" The guy in the khaki shirt didn't answer. Instead, he just turned and walked into the woods, disappearing without a word. I never saw him again. The rangers talked to us for a few more minutes, asking if we were okay and if we needed help packing up. They never mentioned anything about a bear or why someone would have told us to leave. They told us we could stay if we wanted, and after a few minutes of awkward silence, they left. I don't know who that guy was, but I know he wasn't a ranger. And I'll never forget the way he looked at me, like he knew something I didn't. It wasn't just the uniform that threw me off. It was the way he acted, the way he knew exactly how to make me question myself, to make me feel like I was the one who was in the wrong. And the fact that he didn't say a word when he walked off, as though he didn't care if I followed or not. That's what still messes with me. If I hadn't called the station, if I hadn't waited for the backup, who knows what would have happened. I was hiking alone through a remote trail in the mountains last fall when I found the tent. It wasn't anything fancy, just a basic 2-person tent, a little worn but still in one piece. At first, I didn't think much of it. There are a lot of camping sites along this trail, and sometimes people leave their stuff behind when they pack up and leave early. But then I got closer, and I saw the claw marks. At first, I thought it was just some random scuff, maybe from a bear or something else wildlife related. But when I got a closer look, I realized the marks weren't random. They were sharp, deliberate, like something had slashed its way through the fabric. They were deep too. The kind of cuts that you wouldn't expect from an animal, especially not a bear. The tent's walls were shredded in a few places, the jagged lines going down almost to the ground, like something had tried to tear it open. I crouched down next to the tent and poked around the edge of the rips. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle inside. It was empty. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but I certainly didn't expect it to be this quiet. The air was still, and the only noise was the wind gently rustling through the trees. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop, a knife stuck in the ground right outside the tent. It was a clean, modern knife, the kind you buy at a camping store or on Amazon. Not old, not rusty. And it was just lying there, stuck in the dirt, with the handle facing up like it had been tossed there in a hurry. I don't know why, but the sight of that knife made everything feel wrong. The whole thing felt like it was too much to be a simple abandoned campsite. Why would someone leave their knife behind like that, and why in such a weird spot, right outside the tent like they'd just thrown it down and walked away? I stood there for a while, just staring at the knife, trying to make sense of what was going on. Maybe it was just some people who left in a hurry. But then I noticed the tracks around the tent. There were boot prints in the mud, but they were all leading away from the tent. There weren't any prints leading toward it. That's when my mind started to race. I took a step back, scanning the area. There was no one around, nothing. I pulled out my phone to check for service, but of course, there was none. I wasn't that far from the trailhead, but the spot I'd wandered into was a little off the beaten path, hidden behind some thick trees and boulders. I figured it would be a while before anyone came by. But still, the situation felt wrong. Why would someone leave a tent behind, slash it up, and leave their knife like that? Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just an abandoned site where some hikers had a bad experience and left in a hurry. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to check the tent more closely, just to see if there was anything inside. Maybe someone had left something useful behind, or maybe I could find some sign of who had been there. I carefully pulled the zipper open, half expecting something to jump out at me. But inside was nothing. There was a sleeping bag, some camping gear that looked like it hadn't been used in a while, but that was it. No signs of anyone having been there recently, at least nothing obvious. I felt a little better at that point, but not much. The whole thing still didn't sit right with me. I couldn't stop thinking about the knife and those claw marks. Something about it felt like a warning. I decided to leave. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I packed up my gear and started to backtrack down the trail. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just some weird abandoned camp. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I made it about halfway back to the main trail when I heard a noise behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe some branches cracking or an animal moving through the brush. But then I heard it again, a soft crunch of footsteps on the leaves, like someone was walking behind me. I stopped, heart racing. My mind immediately went to the worst possible place. Maybe someone had been watching me this whole time. Maybe whoever left the tent had been nearby, and now they were following me. I turned around, trying to peer into the trees, but I didn't see anything. Just shadows, the fading light of the afternoon, and the empty path behind me. I stood there for a minute, listening, but the noise had stopped. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it wasn't anything. I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I heard a branch crack, every time the wind shifted, I tensed up, expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree. But nothing ever happened. The further I went, the more my anxiety grew. When I finally reached the main trail, I looked back toward where I'd found the tent. It was far enough now that I couldn't see it, but I couldn't shake the image of the knife stuck in the dirt and those claw marks on the tent. Something about it had felt like an omen, like a warning that I didn't know how to interpret. I made it back to the parking lot without any further incidents. I didn't run into anyone else on the trail, and the feeling of being watched slowly faded the further I got from that spot. But as I drove home, I kept thinking about that knife. Who had left it there? And why? What had happened to the people who camped there? And the most terrifying thought of all, was I just being paranoid? Or was someone still out there, watching, waiting for the next person to stumble into their camp? I'll never forget that night in the mountains. I went camping by myself, just a quick weekend getaway to clear my head. I'd done it before, just me, my tent, and the woods. It was supposed to be peaceful, relaxing, but something about that night felt different. I got to the campsite late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the trees. It wasn't a busy area, more of a backwoods kind of spot. The type where you're lucky if you see anyone else, and that's exactly why I liked it. I set up my tent, made a quick dinner over the campfire, and just sat there for a while. It was quiet, too quiet, but that's the kind of silence I was looking for. The kind of silence you can't find in the city. But then, as the sun went down, that's when I first heard the footsteps. It wasn't anything clear at first. Just the sound of something moving in the brush, not too far from the tent. A crack of a twig, a rustle of leaves. I thought maybe it was an animal. I told myself it was an animal. Bears, deer, coyotes, they all wander through the area from time to time. I wasn't too worried. I zipped up the tent, tried to get comfortable, but it felt off. Like I was being watched. I shook it off, figuring it was just nerves, and tried to settle in for the night. But the noises didn't stop. Every so often, I hear something moving outside, just close enough to be unsettling. But whenever I checked, nothing. Just shadows in the dark. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Clear footsteps. The sound of boots on dirt, slow and deliberate. It circled around the tent, like whoever it was pacing. Not walking straight, but moving in a perfect circle, just out of sight. They'd stop. Then start again. Stop. Start again. I held my breath, straining to listen. The wind had died down, so it was just footsteps. Nothing else. Just the sound of boots crunching the ground. I couldn't make out how many people there were. It was just one set of feet at first, but then it started sounding like 2 or 3. I couldn't tell. The only thing I knew for sure was that it was too close for comfort. I lay there frozen, hoping it was nothing. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like they were getting closer. Like they were circling, trying to find a way in. The sounds came in waves, slow and careful, then fast and erratic, like they were unsure of what to do. Every so often, they'd stop, and I'd hold my breath, hoping they'd leave. But they never did. They just kept circling. At one point, I swear I heard something scrape against the outside of my tent. I almost jumped out of my skin. Was someone dragging their hand along the fabric? I didn't know what to think anymore. It was too late to leave. I wasn't even sure I could, with whoever or whatever it was so close. But I wasn't going to get any sleep either. Not with that noise. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, listening to the footsteps circling the tent, hoping dawn would come. And when it finally did, when the first light of day broke through the trees, I thought it was over. The sounds had stopped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, heart still pounding in my chest. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing there, waiting for me. But there was no one. Nothing. Just the quiet of the morning woods. I almost felt relieved. Almost. But then I saw the shoe prints. Dozens of them, scattered all around the tent. They weren't random. They formed a perfect circle, like whoever had been pacing outside had been walking in circles the whole night. The prints were deep, as if whoever had been out there had been wearing heavy boots. I crouched down to get a closer look, and my stomach dropped when I saw that the prints weren't all from the same person. There were different sizes. Some smaller, some bigger, like there had been multiple people walking around my tent. I couldn't make sense of it. My brain tried to tell me it was just a coincidence, but I knew better. There was no way this could be normal. I stood there for a moment, staring at the prints, trying to piece together what had happened. Who had been out there? Why had they been circling my tent all night? And why hadn't I heard anything else? No talking, no movement, nothing except for the footsteps. I felt like I was suffocating. I needed to get out of there. I didn't care if I had to leave all my stuff behind. I just needed to go. The panic was rising in my chest, but I tried to force myself to think clearly. The prints weren't going to answer any questions, and standing there staring at them wasn't going to help either. I grabbed my gear and started packing up. The whole time, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone coming out of the woods, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, empty forest. The world felt too still, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When everything was packed, I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my backpack, zipped up the tent, and started walking fast. I didn't care if I had to take a longer route, I just wanted to get out. The sooner I was back at my car, the better. I kept walking, not looking back. The entire walk back to the trailhead felt like someone was behind me the whole time, just out of sight. Every crunch of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. But there was no one. There never was. When I got to my car, I threw my stuff in the back and got in. I didn't even bother checking if I had everything. I just drove. I didn't stop until I hit the first town, and even then, I just kept going. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what had been outside my tent that night, but I know it wasn't a coincidence. And I've never gone camping by myself again. I've gone camping alone a few times, mostly to get away from everything and have some peace and quiet. A while ago, I decided to take a weekend trip to a secluded part of the woods. It wasn't a popular spot, barely any other campers ever made their way out there, which was exactly what I was looking for. It was the kind of place where the silence felt almost unnatural, but I didn't mind. I actually liked it. I'd gotten there late in the day, so by the time I had everything set up, the sun was starting to set. I figured I'd get a quick fire going and maybe read for a bit before heading to bed. I was in the middle of lighting the fire when I heard a voice. It wasn't close, but it was loud enough to make me turn around. "Hey! You out here solo, too?" I stood up and saw a guy walking toward me, maybe mid-30s, dressed in hiking gear, carrying a big pack. He seemed friendly enough, so I waved. He got closer, and I could see his face more clearly. He smiled, but there was something just a little off about him. Maybe it was his eyes, too intense, or the way his smile didn't quite match his tone. I tried not to read too much into it. "Yeah, just me. It's nice to be out here without a bunch of people around," I said, trying to keep things casual. "Same here," he replied, nodding. "I like it when it's quiet. You got your tent set up already?" I pointed to my tent, and he looked at it for a second, then back at me. "I'm over that way," he said, gesturing behind him. "Just past those trees, a little ways down. It's not much, but it works. I got a few things I'm setting up before dark." He mentioned setting up a few things a couple of times, but I didn't really think much of it. I figured he was talking about his camping gear or something. After some small talk, he asked if I wanted to join him for dinner, but I politely declined. I wasn't in the mood to hang out with someone else just yet. He seemed fine, but I liked my solitude, especially when I was camping. He seemed to take the rejection well, though. "All right, no worries. If you change your mind, I'll be over there," he said with a smile, before turning and heading back toward his camp. I went about my evening, cooked a simple dinner, and read for a bit. I couldn't help but glance over at his campsite once or twice. I don't know why, but something about the way he kept looking around, especially toward my tent, gave me the feeling I wasn't entirely alone out there. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing sounds scratching at the ground, twigs breaking, the usual noises of the forest. But it felt different somehow. I kept thinking I heard someone moving around near my tent, just outside the edges of the light from my fire. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a raccoon or something. But then I heard it again, more clearly this time, footsteps. Not far from me, just beyond where the shadows from my campfire reached. I didn't move, just held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped after a few moments, and I felt a weird sensation that I was being watched. But after a while, the sound stopped completely, and I convinced myself I'd just gotten worked up. Maybe it was nothing. The next day, I decided to take a hike. The guy I met last night was still around his campsite, but he seemed preoccupied with something, so I didn't bother him. I walked down one of the trails, trying to keep my mind off everything and enjoy the quiet. It was about midday when I came across something that gave me pause: trail cameras. I wasn't too surprised at first. I knew some people set them up to watch wildlife or track animal behavior. What threw me off, though, was that these cameras weren't aimed at the forest or the trails. They were pointed directly at my tent. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding. I don't know why it bothered me so much, but it did. Something about the positioning of the cameras seemed too deliberate. The cameras were set at different angles, all focusing on my tent. I quickly glanced around to make sure no one else was in the area. There was no one around, but I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't sure what to do. I walked past the cameras, but I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods felt different now. It felt like I was being watched, even though I knew no one was there. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I headed back to my campsite, trying to push the thought out of my mind. But when I got back, the guy was already there. He was standing just outside my tent, fiddling with something in his hands. I couldn't see what it was from the angle I was at, but he didn't seem to notice me approaching. "Hey!" I called out, louder than I meant to. He turned quickly, a little too quickly. I noticed his face was different now, slightly flushed, like he was caught off guard. He gave a tight smile. "Hey, I was just checking on your tent, making sure everything's good," he said, his tone a little too casual. I blinked, confused. "What do you mean? Why would you be checking on my tent?" "Oh, just making sure it's secure, you know, with the wind and all. Sometimes tents get blown over in the night," he explained, scratching the back of his neck. His smile didn't reach his eyes this time. I nodded slowly, unsure what to say. It seemed like a weird thing to do, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. "Right, thanks, I guess." I quickly zipped up my tent, deciding I wasn't going to engage too much. I didn't know what his deal was, but I wasn't going to stand there and keep talking. As I sat inside, I thought about the cameras again. Why would he have set them up like that? And why hadn't he mentioned them when we spoke earlier? I thought about it for a while, then decided I had to confront him. I grabbed my things, walked out of the tent, and headed toward his camp. When I got there, I could see him sitting by his fire, looking at the ground, lost in thought. I took a deep breath and walked up to him. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I saw some trail cameras out there. The ones pointing at my tent. What's that about?" He looked up at me, and for a second, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, something like annoyance or maybe even panic. But it passed too quickly for me to be sure. He smiled again, but it wasn't the same friendly grin from before. "Oh, those," he said, trying to act casual. "I set them up to keep track of animals. I wasn't sure where the wildlife would be, and I wanted to get some good footage. Didn't think it'd be a big deal." I could tell he was lying. His voice was too smooth, too practiced, like he had this excuse ready. It didn't sit right with me, and I knew I couldn't trust him. I didn't say anything else. I just nodded and turned around, heading back to my campsite without another word. That night, I packed up everything I had left, made sure my tent was properly zipped up, and took one last look around. I didn't care if it was getting dark or if I had to drive through the night. I wasn't sticking around. I left the woods as quickly as I could, never looking back. The whole drive home, I kept wondering if I had been too paranoid or if I had actually seen something off about him. But deep down, I knew that I wasn't wrong to leave. I never went back to that spot. And I never camped solo again. I decided to take a solo hike one weekend. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, just me, the trail, and the mountains. No distractions. I'd been itching to get away from everything and just clear my head. I've hiked before, but this trail was a little more remote than the ones I usually stick to. It was out in the middle of nowhere, and I didn't mind that. If anything, I preferred it. I got an early start that morning. The air was crisp, and the sun was just starting to rise, giving everything a golden hue. I was excited, but a little nervous too, just because I didn't know this trail all that well. Still, I figured it'd be fine. I didn't think much of it as I started walking, just enjoying the quiet and the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt. After a couple of hours, I stopped to take a breather and grab some water. I wasn't far from the last landmark I'd passed, a small, old wooden bridge over a stream. The trail was narrow, and there weren't a lot of other hikers out there. In fact, I hadn't seen anyone all morning. Just me and the occasional bird overhead. But when I stopped, I noticed something odd. I could hear footsteps in the distance. Not close, but definitely there. At first, I didn't think much of it. Other people hike these trails too, right? Still, it struck me as a little strange that I hadn't seen anyone up until now. I figured maybe they were just behind me or coming up from a different part of the trail. I kept drinking my water and wiped my brow, glancing over my shoulder once. The footsteps were still there, but no one was in sight. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was someone on a different part of the trail. But then, the footsteps stopped. Not the usual kind of trail noise where you hear them approach and fade. These stopped completely. For a second, it felt like the air shifted, like the whole forest went still. I waited, but there was nothing. The sound didn't resume. I started walking again, trying to shake off the weird feeling creeping in. But after a few minutes, I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was no mistaking it, someone was following me. Every time I took a step, I heard their footsteps match mine, keeping the exact same pace, staying just far enough away that I couldn't see them. They weren't coming any closer, but they weren't backing off either. I tried stopping again, pretending to stretch, just to see if they'd keep moving past me or do the same. Sure enough, after a few seconds of standing still, I heard the footsteps stop too, right behind me. I could feel the tension in the air. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was there. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. Just trees, rocks, and the narrow trail behind me. I didn't hear anything either. No sounds, no movement. I waited for a few minutes, but nothing changed. I wasn't sure if I should call out, or what. What if it was some random person who just happened to be on the same trail? But then, why were they so far behind? Why weren't they passing me? The uneasy feeling in my gut only grew stronger. I decided I'd keep walking, but this time, I made sure to pick up the pace. If they were going to follow me, I didn't want them to get any closer. But just as I increased my speed, the footsteps picked up too, matching my pace exactly. It was like they were trying to stay right on me. I reached a point where the trail split, leading to a more open area with a nice view of the valley. I figured maybe I'd get a bit of space if I took that route. But as I stepped onto the new path, I heard the steps behind me again. They didn't stop. Whoever it was had changed direction to follow me. I started to panic. The more I tried to act casual, the worse it got. It felt like this person was trying to remain invisible, staying out of sight, but getting closer every time I made a move. I felt trapped, like I couldn't outrun them. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet where every little sound seemed louder than it should be. I stopped again, trying to steady my breath. I didn't want to lose it, but every part of me was screaming to get out of there. The footsteps stopped, exactly like before. I glanced over my shoulder once more. Still nothing. But this time, I thought I saw something. A shadow, just barely noticeable between the trees. Was that the person? Were they watching me? I took off again, this time forcing myself to keep moving without stopping. I was getting close to the point where I'd have to turn back if I didn't find a way to lose them. The trail was winding, narrowing in places, and the forest around me thickened. There were no clear views, and I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my chest, louder than the footsteps now. I came across another clearing, and I tried to make a decision quickly. I needed to see if I could shake this person off, or at least figure out who they were. I stepped off the trail and ducked into the brush, hoping to hide for a moment. The footsteps didn't stop. I stayed as still as I could, crouching behind a large tree, trying to control my breathing. After what felt like forever, I heard the person's footsteps getting closer. They were right there, almost within reach, but they didn't step into the clearing. They just stood still, waiting, listening. That's when I realized what they were doing. They were trying to get me to make a move. They knew I was hiding. I stayed silent, terrified that any sound, even the slightest shift, would give me away. I could feel my muscles twitching with the need to run, but I forced myself to stay put. They were close now. I could hear them breathing, slow and steady, like they were calculating their next step. After what felt like ages, the footsteps started moving again, but this time, they faded into the distance. Whoever it was didn't follow me after that, and I didn't dare look back. I waited until the sounds were gone, and then I took off, running down the trail as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the parking lot. When I finally made it to my car, I was shaking, still too scared to look over my shoulder. I kept glancing at the trees, expecting to see someone emerging from the shadows, but no one ever did. I drove home as fast as I could, my hands tight on the wheel, not letting myself relax until I was safely in my apartment. I still don't know who they were or why they followed me, but I can't shake the feeling that they were just waiting for the right moment to get close. To catch me. I don't know why I didn't think anything of it at first. The whole trip was supposed to be a break, just me, the mountains, and some quiet time away from everything. I'd been planning it for weeks. I even double-checked everything the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, gear. I was as ready as I could be. I arrived at the campsite late, around dusk, and after setting up my tent, I made a quick dinner on the camp stove. Nothing fancy. Just some noodles and a granola bar. I'm not picky when I'm camping alone, and there's something about being outside at night that makes everything feel calm, peaceful, almost like the world is still. I didn't expect anyone else to be out there, honestly. It's a remote site, and most people don't bother with it unless they're serious about hiking. But still, I kept hearing noises. Just animals. Maybe a deer or something. Maybe a raccoon rummaging around. Nothing strange, just the usual stuff. I didn't think much of it. I remember waking up around 2 a.m. because I heard something. I'm a light sleeper, so every little noise wakes me up. But it wasn't anything big. Just some rustling outside the tent. I rolled over and checked my watch. It was way too late for anyone to be passing by. The noise was soft, distant, and I figured it was just a bear or something going through the trash cans down the way. Maybe it was the wind. I fell back asleep quickly, but when I woke up again, it wasn't the usual birds or wind. It was something else. The air was too still, and there was an odd silence. I opened my eyes, squinting into the darkness. I didn't feel right. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I reached out to grab my flashlight. I keep it next to my sleeping bag in case I need it. That's when I noticed the first weird thing. My sleeping bag was gone. The space next to me, where it should have been, was empty. Just the bare ground. My heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't remember getting up. I didn't remember anything that could explain where it went. I sat up fast, scanning the inside of the tent. My bag, the one with all my extra layers and gear, was still there. So was my jacket. My boots were still by the door. But my sleeping bag was gone. Completely gone. I threw back the flap and scrambled outside, hoping to find some explanation. The ground was soft from the rain the night before, and I immediately noticed muddy footprints leading away from my tent. They weren't mine. They were too big, too deep. And they weren't heading toward the campfire, which was still smoldering faintly from earlier. They were heading into the trees, like someone had come up to my tent, unzipped it, and taken my sleeping bag. But why? And who? I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to panic, but I couldn't. I was alone, miles away from the nearest ranger station. And I wasn't about to go charging after whoever had taken it. But the footprints, they went deeper into the woods, not back toward the trail, not where other hikers would have been. They went off the path, into the trees. Into the darkness. I grabbed my backpack, shoved my phone into it, and zipped it up. I was shaking now. This wasn't some prank. Someone had been here. Someone had taken my stuff. And they were still close. I could feel it. I knew the first thing I had to do was get out of there. I didn't care about the sleeping bag anymore. I just needed to get to my car. It was going to take me hours to hike back out, but I couldn't stay here. I grabbed the rest of my stuff, packed it as fast as I could, and looked around one more time. The silence was suffocating. I started walking toward the trail, keeping to the edges of the clearing. I moved as quietly as possible, but my boots were loud on the wet ground. Every little snap of a twig made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, thinking I saw movement in the trees, but when I looked, there was nothing, The farther I walked, the more I felt like I was being watched. It was still dark out, and the trail was hard to follow in the low light, but I knew I couldn't go back to the campsite. The path I was on would eventually lead me out to the road, and from there, I could make my way back to civilization. I just had to keep moving. I couldn't afford to stop. I reached a bend in the trail, and that's when I heard it, footsteps. Not far behind me, but close enough to be heard clearly. The same heavy, deliberate steps. Whoever had taken my sleeping bag was following me. I didn't turn around. I didn't even want to look. I just kept walking, my breath coming faster now, my legs burning with every step. The trail twisted again, and I came across an old, broken-down fence that I had to climb over. I didn't care about the scratches on my hands. All I cared about was getting out of there. But when I climbed over and looked back at the trail, the footsteps had stopped. I stood there, frozen, straining to hear something, anything. Silence. I was alone. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. But the pit in my stomach wouldn't let me relax. I took a few more steps, then stopped to listen. No more footsteps. No more sound at all. The air was thick with tension, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I moved faster now, not caring about the quiet, just wanting to get out of the woods. The trail was getting narrower, and the trees were closing in around me, but I kept my eyes ahead. There was nothing behind me anymore. No one. Just the echo of my own footsteps. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the parking lot. My car was the only one there. I didn't care about the car. I didn't care about anything except getting in and locking the doors. I fumbled for my keys, my hands too shaky to even hold them. But finally, I was inside. And when I started the engine, I didn't look back. I didn't want to see anything. I just drove. I don't know who it was out there, or why they took my sleeping bag. Maybe they were just some random person looking to mess with a solo hiker. But something tells me that's not it. I don't know what they wanted, but I'm not going back out there. Ever. I didn't think anything was wrong at first. When you're out camping by yourself, you tend to get a little paranoid, right? The wind rustles the leaves, and every creak in the trees makes you jump. I was used to it by now, mostly. I've been camping alone for years. But this time was different. I'd been at the site for a couple of days. The hike up was quiet, and when I set up camp, everything seemed fine. No one else around. That's how I liked it. I picked a spot that was kind of out of the way, up on a ridge with a decent view. I figured I wouldn't be bothered. That was the plan, some quiet, peaceful time alone, away from everything. The kind of trip that resets you. The first night passed with nothing out of the ordinary. A few noises in the dark, some animals moving around, but that was it. I cooked a little dinner on my camp stove and watched the sun set over the mountains. Nothing unusual. The second day, though, that's when I started to feel weird. It wasn't anything obvious. Just little things. Like how the wind stopped completely around noon. Total silence, which, yeah, could be normal. But it was that kind of silence that felt wrong, like the air was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, grabbed my pack, and went for a hike around the area to stretch my legs. I didn't see anyone else, which was typical for that part of the park. I came back to camp a few hours later, and everything seemed the same, nothing disturbed, Nothing moved, but I still had that feeling, like something was off. I decided to go to bed early that night, thinking I could shake it off. I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to relax, listening to the crackling of the campfire as it slowly died out. The forest was calm again, the wind had picked up a little, but nothing unusual. I eventually fell asleep. I woke up around 3 a.m., feeling like I'd heard something. It wasn't loud, just enough to pull me from sleep. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe an animal. But then I noticed something, the silence. It was too still, like the forest itself was holding its breath again. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the tent walls, straining my ears to listen. I couldn't hear anything. No animals. No wind. Just quiet. I tried to brush it off and went back to sleep. The next morning, I got up, made my coffee, and decided to do some more exploring. The weather was nice, and I figured a short walk might help clear my head. But when I stepped outside, something caught my eye. It was muddy, fresh tracks in the ground leading straight to my tent. I froze. I wasn't paranoid enough to think someone had come into my camp, but I knew I'd been the only one around for miles. No one had passed through in hours. The only tracks I'd seen were mine, from when I set up camp. But now, these prints, they were deep and clearly fresh. The mud was still soft from the rain the day before, and these footprints had to have been made in the last couple of hours, tops. I crouched down to get a closer look. The prints were oddly shaped. They weren't from a boot, or at least not like any boot I recognized. They looked like they were made by a bare foot, but they were way too big to belong to any animal. The toes were oddly spread, like someone had really dug their foot into the mud. I couldn't even make sense of the size. It was bigger than any human print I'd ever seen. I stood there for a few moments, trying to make sense of it. The tracks started at the edge of my campsite, right by the tree line, and went straight toward my tent. There were no other tracks nearby, no sign that someone had been walking through the area before that. It was like whoever had made these footprints had appeared out of nowhere. I got this cold feeling creeping up my spine. I didn't like it. It was like the air had shifted again. Something wasn't right. I couldn't ignore it. My instincts were telling me to pack up and leave, but I wasn't ready to freak out over a few strange footprints. Not yet. I decided to follow the tracks. They led me around the back of my tent, circling it a few times. The footprints were getting deeper, like the person had been walking around in the mud, pacing, maybe. I kept my distance but followed the trail. The more I looked at it, the more I realized how strange it was that the prints didn't stop at the tent. They went all the way around, like whoever had made them had been walking in a circle. The muddy footprint trail didn't make any sense. I turned back toward the tent, and that's when I saw it. The flap to my tent was unzipped just a little, but enough that the zipper was pulled halfway down. I knew I had zipped it completely when I'd gone to sleep. My heart started racing. I wasn't sure what to think. Was someone out there? Had someone been in my tent? I couldn't imagine it. The place was isolated, and I hadn't heard anything. Still, my mind was racing, trying to come up with some explanation. Maybe it was an animal, maybe the wind had caught it, but nothing made sense. I stood there for a second, trying to make myself calm down. I knew I had to check inside, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I stood there, staring at the tent, waiting for something, anything, to explain what had happened. But nothing did. I finally walked over, unzipped the flap all the way, and peeked inside. Nothing seemed disturbed. My sleeping bag was still there, my gear untouched. But the feeling in my gut wasn't going away. I looked back at the prints again, still going in circles around the tent. My mind was telling me to leave. My gut was telling me someone had been here, close to my tent, watching me. I packed up my things quickly, not bothering to take my time. I shoved everything into my bag, not caring about being neat. I was ready to get out of there. But the more I thought about it, the more the weirdness of it all sank in. The tracks, the pacing, the unzipped tent. Whoever had been here had watched me, maybe even for hours. And when I left, they would know I'd seen the footprints. They might be watching me now. By the time I had everything packed, I was practically running down the trail. The air felt too thick, like I was being smothered by it. I didn't even care that I was leaving my camp behind, my gear scattered in a mess. I needed to get to my car, needed to feel safe again. As I moved farther down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was behind me. But when I made it to my car, I looked back up at the mountain, and I realized no one had followed me. I don't know who or what was out there that morning, but I'll never forget those footprints. They were too strange, too deliberate. I don't think I'll ever go back to that spot again. I never thought much about being alone in the woods until it happened. I'd gone camping by myself plenty of times. It was one of my favorite things to do, just get away from everything, hike, sit by the fire, no one to bother me. So when I decided to head out for a weekend trip, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. I picked a spot I had been to a few times before, out in a small, relatively quiet part of the forest. There was a lake nearby, a bit of a hike from the trailhead, but it wasn't too far. Just the perfect distance to get away without feeling like I was too far off the grid. I liked it there because it wasn't heavily trafficked. Sure, you might see a couple of people over the course of a few days, but it wasn't crowded, and I could always count on a bit of solitude. I got there around mid-afternoon and started setting up camp. The weather was nice, cool, but not too cold, with a slight breeze. Perfect camping weather. I found a nice spot near the lake, tucked away enough that I could still enjoy the view but wouldn't be too exposed. The ground was soft enough to stake my tent into, but not muddy. It felt like a good spot. I was in the middle of setting up the tent when I heard a branch snap behind me. I didn't think much of it at first. Animals are always lurking around when you're camping. But then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. Not the quick, scurrying sounds you get from small animals, but heavy, human footsteps. I turned around, expecting to see another camper, maybe someone who had passed through and wanted to chat. But no! There was a man, maybe in his early 40s, tall, with a scruffy beard. He had a backpack on, and his clothes were worn, like he'd been hiking for a while. He didn't look like he was from around here, though. He had that look of someone who wasn't used to being out in the woods. He stood there for a moment, just staring at me. I felt a little uncomfortable, like maybe I was intruding on something, but I tried to brush it off. People hike through places like this all the time. Maybe he just needed a break. "Hey," he said, his voice flat. "You need to move." I blinked at him, confused. "What?" "This is my spot," he repeated, a little more firmly this time. "I've been coming here for years. You need to pack up and leave." I glanced around, trying to figure out what he was talking about. There was no one else in sight. No tents. No signs of anyone else having been there recently. I had been hiking for a few hours and hadn't seen another soul. "I don't know what you mean," I said, trying to stay calm. "I'm just setting up. I didn't see anyone else around." He didn't respond, just stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Doesn't matter. This is my spot. You're not welcome here. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a casual request, it felt like a command. Like I had done something wrong just by being there. I took a half step back, looking around again. Nothing. No other campers. The spot was isolated. It was just me and this guy standing there, and for some reason, I was starting to get a bad feeling. Look, I'm just camping for the weekend. I'm not bothering anyone, I said, trying to reason with him. There's plenty of space around here. You can pick another spot if you want. He shook his head slowly, his eyes still locked onto mine. No. This is mine. You've got to go. I'll make you. I was starting to get nervous. I've camped alone before, but something about this guy's tone felt off. It wasn't just a request to leave, it was the aggression behind it, like he was trying to intimidate me. I glanced down at my gear, then back at him. I'm not going anywhere, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. This is public land. You can't just claim a spot like that. His eyes never left mine, and for a second, I thought he might actually charge at me. But instead, he just stood there, watching me. The silence between us grew heavy, like there was something unsaid that we both knew but weren't willing to acknowledge. Finally, he broke the silence. Fine, he said, his voice suddenly low. But don't say I didn't warn you. You won't be able to sleep here tonight. I frowned. What's that supposed to mean? He didn't answer. He just turned and started walking off, his boots crunching on the ground as he moved through the trees. I stood there for a minute, not sure what to do. Was he just crazy? Did he think he owned the whole forest? I watched him disappear into the trees, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I couldn't explain it, but something told me that this guy wasn't just going to let it go. He had that look in his eye, like he wasn't finished with me. I stood there for a few moments, trying to calm myself down. I'd been in tense situations before, but this felt different. I had no idea what he might do next, and I wasn't sure how far he was willing to go to claim this spot. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip, and here I was, starting to feel like I was in danger. But I didn't want to pack up and leave just yet. It wasn't like he had any right to run me off. I tried to push it out of my mind and finish setting up my tent. As I worked, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept hearing small noises, like twigs snapping or rustling in the underbrush, but every time I looked up, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my nerves, but I couldn't stop feeling like he was out there, somewhere, waiting for me to make a mistake. As the afternoon wore on, I kept checking my surroundings. There was still no sign of a man, but I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. Around sunset, I started a fire, hoping it would make me feel a little safer. The light from the flames flickered in the growing darkness, casting long, eerie shadows in the trees. That night, I heard footsteps again, slow, deliberate. The sound came from somewhere close by. I tensed, staring into the darkness. There was no moon, and the forest was thick with shadows. I grabbed my flashlight, but when I shined it around, nothing was there. The sound stopped. The rest of the night was quiet, too quiet. But I didn't sleep much, my ears straining for any sign of movement, my mind racing. Every little noise set me on edge. By morning, I was ready to leave. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. There was no sign of a man, but I didn't feel safe staying there any longer. The woods were supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it felt like I was being hunted, and I didn't want to find out what would happen if I stayed. As I walked back to the trailhead, I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but the dread was still there, creeping at the edges of my mind. Whoever that man was, I don't think he was ever planning on letting me stay. I was a few miles in when I saw the fire. It wasn't anything spectacular, just a small orange glow flickering through the trees. But at the time, it stopped me in my tracks. I'd been hiking for hours, and the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The woods were quiet except for the usual rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. I had planned to do a solo hike to clear my head, nothing fancy. Just a weekend in the woods, away from everything. The trail wasn't heavily trafficked, which was exactly why I picked it. I like being alone, the kind of solitude where the only thing you hear is your own thoughts. But as I walked, I started to notice something off. Nothing huge at first, just small details, like the way the wind seemed to die down as I passed certain areas, or how the trees started to feel a little too close, like they were leaning in. Anyway, when I saw the fire, I figured it was just a group of campers. It wasn't uncommon to see others out there, especially with the weekend crowds, but I couldn't remember passing anyone else on the trail. I kept my pace steady, but I had been lost in my head for most of the hike. Still, I figured they'd pass me at some point. I approached cautiously, not sure what to expect. The closer I got, the more I realized how strange it was. The fire wasn't in any kind of designated campsite, just a random patch of dirt, surrounded by trees. It wasn't large, maybe about the size of a campfire you'd use for cooking, but it was bright enough to see the people sitting around it. There were 6 of them, sitting on logs or the ground. They were hunched forward, staring into the fire, and none of them spoke. No one laughed or joked, which I thought was odd. I mean, even on a quiet camping trip, there's usually some talking, right? But this group didn't make a sound. Just staring at the fire, like they were waiting for something. Or someone. I tried to act normal, not wanting to seem like I was intruding, but something about the scene didn't sit right with me. I walked past them, hoping they wouldn't notice me too much, but I could feel their eyes on me as I did. It wasn't like a quick glance or a casual look, it was like each of them was turning their head slightly, just enough to track me with their eyes as I walked by. Every single one. I couldn't help but quicken my pace, pretending to ignore it, but my heart was starting to beat faster. I was a little more than halfway past them when I felt someone's eyes on the back of my neck. The weird thing was, it wasn't just one person, it was all of them. I didn't even have to look, but I could tell. Their gazes were so heavy, like they were watching every move I made. I wanted to just keep walking, act like it was no big deal, but the way they were all staring at me made my stomach drop. I tried to focus on the trail in front of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. These weren't your usual friendly hikers or campers. There was no friendliness in their silence, only a kind of oppressive stillness that made me feel like an outsider. As I passed the last person, a woman sitting closest to the edge of the fire, I swear I saw her lips move, but it wasn't in a way that made sense. Like she was trying to speak without making a sound. I stopped for a second, my brain scrambling to make sense of it. But then she looked away, back to the fire, and I was already walking again, my heart racing in my chest. I tried to push the weirdness out of my mind and kept walking. There wasn't much daylight left, and I needed to set up camp. But the whole thing lingered in my thoughts. The silence, the way their eyes followed me, the strange, almost silent movement from the woman, it was like they were all waiting for me to do something. Waiting for me to turn around, to engage with them. The woods felt different now. I couldn't explain it, but the air seemed thicker, like the trees were closing in around me. My footsteps seemed too loud, too heavy, like I was disturbing something. I tried to focus on the path, but the sensation of being watched never left. And then, the quiet. The absolute, suffocating silence of the woods. The birds had stopped calling, and the wind wasn't blowing anymore. I made it to the next clearing and decided to set up camp. It felt like the right place to stop, but as I unpacked my gear, I couldn't shake the thought of those people. What were they doing there, all alone, staring into the fire like that? Why didn't they speak? Why hadn't they greeted me when I walked by? All these questions circled in my head as I tried to set up my tent as quickly as I could. The sun was gone now, and the woods were growing darker by the second. I lit my own campfire, hoping it would give me some sense of security, but it didn't. The quiet from before had settled back in, like something was wrong with the entire forest. I felt like I was in a vacuum, like the world around me had gone still and everything was watching, waiting for something to happen. I didn't want to go to bed too early, but by the time I got my tent set up, the darkness felt thick enough to swallow me whole. I sat by my fire for a while, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. That those people were just another group of weird hikers, nothing more. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I kept hearing things from the woods. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, like someone or something was moving just outside the light of the fire. I looked toward the fire I'd passed earlier, and I swear, in the distance, I could see the glow again, faint but visible through the trees. But this time, I didn't hear anything. No crackling of the flames, no movement. It was just that eerie stillness again. I stood up, trying to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone. That they were out there, watching me. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But the longer I sat there, the more it felt like the night was closing in around me. I don't know how long I stayed up, but eventually, I felt the need to check my surroundings. As I walked toward the edge of my camp, I thought I heard something in the distance. A soft whisper, too faint to make out, but it sounded like someone was talking. It was just enough to make my blood run cold. I went back to the fire and waited. I couldn't sleep, but I didn't want to go out into the woods in the dark either. I just sat there, watching the flicker of my fire, trying not to look toward where the group had been. The rest of the night passed in a blur of unease. I didn't hear the footsteps or the whispers again, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched. In the morning, when the sun finally rose, I packed up my camp quickly and didn't look back as I walked away. I never saw those people again, and I never figured out what they were doing out there. But I've never felt that same sense of discomfort on a hike since, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to shake the feeling of being watched in those woods. I've always loved hiking alone. There's something about being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and the quiet, that's just peaceful. At least, it used to be. This one trip, though, completely changed the way I think about being out in the wilderness. I had set out on a solo hike in a remote part of the forest, a trail I had been eyeing for a while. It wasn't too far from a small town, but it was far enough out that I didn't expect to see anyone. That was the point. I wanted some solitude, a break from everything. I packed light, just enough food for a couple of days, a tent, and the usual hiking gear. Nothing too fancy. I didn't even bring my phone. I wanted to be disconnected, you know? The first day was great. The weather was perfect, sunny, clear skies, not too hot. The trail was beautiful, and I felt at ease. No one around, just me in the woods. I camped at a little clearing I found, set up my tent, made a small fire, and enjoyed the quiet. No one came by, and I liked it that way. The next morning, I woke up early, made some coffee, and packed up camp. I planned on hiking another few miles before turning back. But as the day went on, the trail started to get harder. The sun was still up, but the further I went, the thicker the trees became, and the quieter it got. It's funny, when you're out there, you get used to certain sounds. The wind through the leaves, the birds calling. But then, suddenly, it just stopped. Not all at once, but slowly. You don't notice it at first, but then it's like you're the only one left in the world. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the time of day or whatever. Still, I felt uneasy. The trail was starting to feel unfamiliar, like I was walking in circles. I kept looking over my shoulder, not sure why. Every little sound made me jump, but when I turned around, there was nothing. I thought I might have just been tired and kept pushing forward. By the time I decided to turn back, the sun was starting to dip below the trees. I figured I'd just make my way back to camp, grab my stuff, and head out the next day. It wasn't too far. Maybe an hour, 2 at most. When I got back to my camp, though, it didn't look right. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The fire pit wasn't where I left it, and my tent was slightly off-center, but I thought maybe the wind had moved it. But then I realized something. My gear was gone. All of it. My tent, sleeping bag, food, even my backpack. Gone. Like someone had taken it. I froze, standing there in the middle of the clearing. The only thing left was my campfire, still smoldering faintly, and a small piece of paper, crumpled up next to where my bag should have been. I walked over to it, almost too afraid to touch it. When I unfolded it, the words were simple: "We'll be back for the rest." I don't even remember what I thought at that moment. It was like my brain couldn't process what was happening. I looked around, but the trees were empty. The wind had picked up again, but there was no one. Nothing. It was just quiet. Too quiet. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the note, but when I finally looked up, my heart dropped. There were tracks, footprints leading away from my camp. Not from a trail, but from the woods. They were fresh, the kind of print you get from someone walking in soft ground, deep enough to leave a mark but not so deep that they were muddy. They looked like they'd been made recently. I don't know why, but I decided to follow them. Maybe I thought I'd find my stuff. Maybe I thought I was just being paranoid. But I followed those tracks, my heart pounding in my chest, every step heavier than the last. The more I walked, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It felt like I was being watched, even though there was no one around. The trail twisted and turned, going deeper into the woods, farther away from my camp. I didn't know what I expected. I guess I thought someone would pop out and explain everything, maybe some other hiker who decided to have some fun with me. But as I went deeper, I started to realize how stupid I was for following these tracks. My brain screamed at me to turn back, but I kept going, driven by something I couldn't explain. I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that it was just some sick joke. The tracks led me to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. There, sitting in the middle of the clearing, was a pile of my gear. My backpack, my tent, my sleeping bag, all of it. But it wasn't just left there haphazardly. It was arranged, like someone had placed it there on purpose. The sleeping bag was open, almost like it had been used, and my backpack had been unzipped. My food was gone. Everything was gone. I stood there, staring at the pile for what felt like an eternity, when I heard something, a branch snapping. I whipped around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. just the wind blowing through the trees. I don't know what came over me, but I didn't wait to find out. I turned around and started running back to my camp, panic setting in. I didn't look back as I ran, but I could hear something behind me. Footsteps, crunching through the leaves, close enough that it made my stomach flip. I pushed myself harder, but my legs felt like lead. The sound of the footsteps got louder, closer. I could feel them right behind me, but every time I turned around, I saw nothing. Just trees. I finally made it back to my camp, but the fear hadn't left me. I grabbed my remaining things and ran, running faster than I ever thought I could. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. The car was still there. The silence of the woods felt like a 1,000-pound weight on my chest, but I didn't care. I didn't stop. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I never went back to that trail. I've told myself 100 times that it was probably just some other hikers, maybe a prank, but I know deep down that what happened out there wasn't normal. The note, the tracks, the way they took everything but left that message. I don't know if they were watching me the whole time, or if it was just coincidence, but I'll never forget that feeling, that sense of being hunted, even when no one was there. It was one of those trips that seemed like a good idea at the time. A solo camping trip deep into the woods. I'd done it before, hiked alone, camped out, disconnected from the world for a while. This time, I figured I'd go for something a little more remote, just to get away from it all. A weekend alone, with nothing but the trees and the quiet. No distractions. No people. Just me, my tent, and some food. The first day was great. The hike wasn't too bad. The sun was out, the air was fresh, and everything felt calm. I set up camp in a secluded spot near a stream, far enough off the trail that I wouldn't see anyone for a while. I unpacked, set up my tent, and spent the evening watching the fire flicker while I ate. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. The night came quickly. It always does when you're out there. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the forest became sharper. I built up the fire a little more and tried to relax. But I had this weird sense that something wasn't quite right. Nothing specific, just this nagging feeling like I wasn't alone. I brushed it off. It's easy to convince yourself that you're just being paranoid when you're in the middle of nowhere. I got into my tent around 9, zipped it up, and settled in for the night. It didn't take long before I was drifting off to sleep. But then, in the dead of night, I was pulled out of a deep sleep by a sound that made my heart race. Rustling. It was soft at first, just a faint noise that made me stir. I thought maybe it was an animal. Something small moving around near the camp. The wind had picked up a little, and I figured it was probably just leaves being blown around. But then the rustling came again, this time closer. And then, silence. I froze. My heart was pounding now. I had that feeling, the kind you get when you know something's wrong, but you can't quite figure out what it is. I laid there, trying to make sense of it, my ears straining to catch any other sound. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again, rustling, but now it was right outside my tent. I stayed still, barely breathing, trying not to make a sound. I could hear the crunch of something stepping on dry leaves, moving around my tent. Whoever or whatever was out there was close. Too close. I was trying to come up with a logical explanation, something to ease the panic that was rising in my chest. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. Animals, I told myself. Animals don't do anything unless they're after food. But the rustling didn't stop. It kept going, slow and deliberate, like someone was moving around, trying not to make a sound. My mind was racing. What the hell was going on? I waited for what felt like forever. When the rustling finally stopped, I thought maybe whoever or whatever had just moved on. But then I heard a faint sound, like a zipper being pulled open. A chill ran down my spine. My food bag. I hung it outside my tent, like I always do, so animals wouldn't get to it. The sound stopped again, and I held my breath. I had to know what was going on. But I was too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. I waited in the dark, my eyes wide open, straining to hear anything else. Then I heard it. A sharp snap, something like a knife cutting through fabric. And then a muffled thud. That was it. I couldn't stay in that tent anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, holding my breath, trying to move as quietly as I could. My heart was pounding in my chest, every muscle in my body tense. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, just enough to slip outside. My hands were shaking, but I managed to get out without making too much noise. I stepped out into the night, the cold air hitting me all at once. The moonlight barely lit the clearing, but I could see the shadow of the tree line in front of me. There was nothing moving in the woods. No animals. No people. Just the wind. And then I saw it. My food bag, hanging from a branch, swinging lightly in the breeze. The bag had been cut open, sliced right through the fabric, the contents spilling out onto the ground. My granola bars, dried fruit, and snacks were scattered in a heap. It was like someone had taken a knife to it, deliberately cutting open the bag and taking whatever they wanted. I froze. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to run. Just grab my stuff and get out of there. But I couldn't move. I was stuck, paralyzed by fear. Who would do something like this? Who was out there? I scanned the area around me, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the trees, but there was nothing except the mess of my food bag. No movement. No sound. But then I heard something again, footsteps, distant but unmistakable. I couldn't tell how far away they were, but they were coming from the direction of the trees. I squinted, trying to make out any shape, any figure, but all I saw was darkness. It was a low, deliberate step, like someone was trying to stay quiet. Someone was out there. Someone was close. I snapped the flashlight off, my heart racing. I needed to get back to my tent, to grab my things and get the hell out of there. But my legs felt like lead, like they wouldn't move. I was so sure someone was out there, watching me. The footsteps stopped, and for a second, everything was silent. My breath felt too loud in my ears, my chest tight. I had to go. I had to leave now. I ran. No hesitation. No second thoughts. I sprinted back to my tent, grabbing whatever I could find. My sleeping bag, my backpack, anything I could carry. I didn't look back, not once. I knew I couldn't. I didn't stop running until I was back at the parking lot, panting and terrified. I couldn't tell if anyone had followed me. I didn't care. I never went back to that trail. And I haven't camped alone since. Whoever or whatever was out there, cutting open my food bag in the middle of the night, I didn't want to find out what they wanted. I didn't want to know who they were. All I knew was that I was lucky to make it out of there in one piece. I went camping solo to get away for a weekend. Just me, the woods, and some quiet time to myself. I've done it before, nothing unusual. It was a Friday evening when I set up my tent by the edge of a small lake. There was nobody around for miles, just the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. I figured I'd be alone, which was exactly what I wanted. I'm not much of a people person, and being in the middle of nowhere with no distractions felt like a relief. I had a nice dinner by the campfire, then crawled into my tent around 9:30. I'd made a point to avoid looking at my phone too much, no service anyway, and just listen to the sounds of the night. Everything felt peaceful, calm. The perfect night. I lay back on my sleeping bag, not even worrying about locking the tent flap. I felt safe, even though I was in the woods alone. At some point, I must have drifted off. I had this weird dream, or maybe it was more of a half-dream. I remember hearing noises, footsteps, but I couldn't make them out clearly. It was like a whispering wind, a rustling in the brush, then silence again. But I didn't wake up. Not all the way. It was like my brain was just processing noises and not really acknowledging them. I brushed it off and went back to sleep. Then, out of nowhere, I woke up. It wasn't the sound of anything in particular, it was more like an instinct, a gut feeling. You know that feeling when you wake up and know something's off, but you can't quite place it? Like something just isn't right. I opened my eyes and immediately felt it. That eerie sense that I wasn't alone. The moonlight was filtering in through the mesh window of the tent, and at first, I thought it was just a tree branch moving in the wind, casting a shadow. But when I focused, I saw something else. Someone. Standing just outside my tent. I couldn't make out their face, just a silhouette. They were so close that I could see the shape of their body against the dim light, but no detail. I stared, trying to make sense of it. My heart was hammering, my breath catching in my throat. Maybe it was another hiker who'd gotten lost. Maybe they just wanted to say hi or needed help. But then I realized this person wasn't moving. They were just standing there, perfectly still, watching. I held my breath, and for a long time, neither of us moved. I couldn't see if they were looking directly at me, but I could feel it. There was no sound, nothing except the rustling leaves and the faint chirping of crickets, like everything had gone still for this moment. "Hello?" I said quietly. No response. I shifted slightly, just enough to make a noise, and tried again, louder this time. "Hey, can I help you?" Still nothing. No movement. No sound. Nothing at all. My stomach churned. This was wrong. I didn't know if it was just some weird hiker or if it was someone who had been watching me for a while, but either way, I didn't feel safe. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on. It barely made a dent in the dark, but it was enough to reflect off the mesh window and catch the outline of the figure again. The flashlight's beam caught their silhouette for just a split second, and I swear I saw them move slightly. They shifted, but still didn't speak, didn't do anything. I was stuck in a panic loop. Should I call out again? Should I grab my stuff and just leave? Should I try to talk to them, ask them what they wanted? I felt frozen in place. The longer I stared, the more I started to feel like I was staring at a statue, like a person who was just there, not responding. It wasn't even creepy at first, it was just confusing. But then, the longer they stood there, the more I started to get this heavy, sick feeling. I took a breath and called out once more, "Hey, are you okay?" Still nothing. At this point, my panic started creeping in. I wasn't sure if they couldn't hear me, or if they were deliberately ignoring me. Or worse, maybe they weren't even human. I could feel my hands shaking, gripping the flashlight like it was some sort of lifeline. The silence outside my tent felt suffocating, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I made myself think rationally. This was just someone out there. Someone who maybe didn't know how to approach a solo camper, or someone who was just waiting for the right moment to say something. But the longer they stayed silent, the more my brain started coming up with worse and worse scenarios. The last thing I wanted to do was freak out and make a wrong move, but I knew I couldn't stay in the tent forever. I decided to get up, get my boots on, and get ready to leave, just in case. I knew I could make a run for it. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, trying not to make noise. I poked my head out, shining the flashlight in the direction of the figure. Nothing. I looked around, my heart pounding. They were gone. No trace of anyone near my tent, nothing. I almost couldn't believe it. Had I imagined the whole thing? I stood there for a second, trying to make sense of it, and then I heard something, footsteps, soft, but unmistakable, like someone was walking away from my camp. I didn't wait to see if they came back. I grabbed my bag and bolted, not even thinking about whether it was safe to leave my stuff behind. I ran to the car, heart pounding in my chest, praying I wasn't being followed. I never went back to that spot. And every time I think about it, I still can't shake the image of that person standing there in the dark, staring at me without saying a word. I don't know who they were, what they wanted, or why they didn't say anything. But I knew one thing for sure. They weren't just lost. They weren't a normal hiker, and they weren't someone I ever wanted to meet again.